When it comes to small towns, there seems to be one rule. The smaller the town, the more rumors and urban legends there are. This is especially true for small, remote towns in the middle of nowhere. Whatever semblance of history they have is often filled with odd and mysterious events. These tales often center on hideous murders, ghosts haunting certain localities, visits by the devil, and other similar yarns. One can ponder the reason. It might give the town a certain semblance of importance, to set it apart from neighboring communities. Or it's nothing but an outlet caused by boredom and the ever-present mundanity. It makes it seem as if every small, isolated town is a center of the supernatural. My hometown was no different. Tales and urban legends were almost ubiquitous in its history, and intertwined with all events that happened here. One thing about my hometown was different, however. All our rumors, all our urban legends, seemed to be related to one place and one place alone: the Jensen boarding house. It was an old building, a former boarding house standing alone at the far edge of town, only a few dozen meters shy of the woods. The place was a monstrosity of a building, and seemed to have been extended many times during its existence. Yet, if not for the rumors, the place might have been called inconspicuous. Just another building. One that had been abandoned decades ago, and was now nothing but a remnant of the past. Back in my grandfather's day, the place had been the town's main attraction, and was far more than a mere place for travelers to stay the night. It served as a gathering place for the town's youth, to share drinks and play cards, a dance hall for the annual village fair, and on rare occasions even an impromptu cinema. One day, however, something unexpected happened. With no formal announcement, the place closed its doors to the public. Even stranger, the owner, Mr. Jensen, abandoned it, and left not only the boarding house, but the town behind, family in tow. All over the course of a single night. This event spawned many of our small town's rumors and urban legends, for people wondered what had happened, and what had prompted the family's sudden flight. Over the years, as the place grew in age, more and more of these tales were spread by the town's inhabitants, many by people who never actually set foot inside. The very first of these tales were as normal as the building itself. They talked about economic recessions, debts, and Mr. Jensen having grown tired of our small community, or a certain spat with another family. As the years ticked by, however, these tales changed, and came into a life of their own. They hinted at more sinister events at play. Events related not only to its owner, but to the boarding house itself. There were tales of blood and thunder, of dark rituals, and cultish activities. Eventually, the boarding house itself became as abominable a place as all these tales. It was haunted by ghosts. Its basement and high attic were populated by twisted creatures, and even the devil itself called it its home. They were all ridiculous, of course. Yet one thing was odd about the place. One thing that guaranteed that the rumors would never truly die out. While its yard was unkempt and overgrown, the old boarding house itself was still in decent condition. All the windows were intact, none of the doors had been broken down, and thick curtains hid the interior from all prying eyes. An interior that was just as its owner and his family had left it behind, and supposedly still fully furnished. As a child, the old boarding house was an ever-looming presence. Yet my friends and I never ventured forth or approached it. All we did was to steal looks at it from afar. The building had an atmosphere, one fueled by the many tales and rumors surrounding it, and one that demanded not only respect, but also instilled us with a deep fear. At this time, I didn't know just how many events in our small town were actually related to it, and how, unbeknownst to me, some of my earliest adventures were too. I was no older than 8 when I first acted on one of the many rumors surrounding the Jensen boarding house. Like many others, it began as a set of loosely related tales, all with a name of their own. People talked about the Jensen beast, the horror from the boarding house, and the beast of the basement. Eventually, they were merged into one, that of the beast. It was a creature that supposedly lurked in the woods surrounding our town, and lay in wait for anyone who ventured off too far, or strayed off the well-known paths. The rumors began when a young man, who'd been vacationing in a cabin near town, went missing out there. One day he set out on a hike, and was never seen or heard from again. Amongst the local kids and teenagers, the story spread like wildfire, and was soon spun into yarns related to the Jensen boarding house. The beast, be it demon, ghost, or monsters, must have escaped from there, and now roamed the woods. The missing young man, some said, wasn't even the creature's first victim, but one of many in a series that went back decades. Why had no one heard about it until now? Because all information about the beast's existence was kept a secret, and never talked about in the open. I first heard the story from one of my two best friends, Eric. He, in turn, had heard it from his cousin, whose friend's great uncle had spied the beast himself. Who these mysterious friend and great uncle were, Eric couldn't tell me, of course. That's just how rumors go. They always happen to a distant relative of a friend of a friend. Always. Yet we were both kids. Dumb kids at that, and so we wholeheartedly believed it. What added to our conviction, and fueled the roaring fires of curiosity that so burned in our young minds, was that our parents forbade us from entering the woods. They said the police were conducting an extended search for the missing man, and thus had declared them off limits, especially for meddlesome kids. To us, and many other kids, these were all lies. A conspiracy by the adults to keep the beast's existence hidden, and proof that the creature was not just out there, but had indeed taken the man. It wasn't long before Eric wanted to investigate himself. He was the most curious kid in town, the one with the most bravado, and at 8 years old, the word danger hadn't entered his vocabulary yet. One afternoon, my other best friend Jerry and I were at the soccer field kicking a ball around, when Eric arrived on his bike. As so many times before, he jumped off, threw it aside, and raced toward us to share the latest rumors regarding the beast with us. It was always stories about travelers or drifters who'd supposedly seen it, or who'd been taken by it. By this point, Eric had been going on about nothing else for almost 2 weeks. Yet, while I was as taken by these tales as he was, and hungry for any and all news, Jerry had grown more than annoyed by his obsession. For the first couple of days, he'd been as excited about it as we were. But once his older brother Bill told him it was all bullshit, his interest evaporated. The moment Eric mentioned the beast, Jerry groaned, and in his frustration kicked the soccer ball to the other end of the field. "Can't you talk about anything else? It's such bullshit." "It's not bullshit," Eric laid into him. "You're just a baby who's afraid the beast will come for him." "What'd you hear?" I cut in, ignoring their argument. While Eric began to tell me, a frustrated Jerry went to get his ball. "I'm going to hang it with Bill," he mumbled as he walked off. "Don't let the beast get you," Eric called after him, chuckling. Then he turned back to me and continued to tell me about yet another encounter someone had had with the beast. A good decade ago, a traveling merchant tried to find a shortcut through the woods, and barely escaped with his life. I listened intently, and with each of Eric's words, my eyes grew wider. "You know what we should do?" Eric blurted once he was done with the story, his voice changing to a conspiratorial whisper. "We should go into the woods and prove the beast is real." "But, no, Rick, listen. If we do, we'll get a reward. We'll be heroes." Right away, the words reward and hero spurred my imagination. In my mind, I saw applauding people, newspaper articles, but most of all, the N64 gaming console my mom didn't want to get me. Then I remembered the woods were off limits, and how adamant my parents were about it. "I want to," I mumbled, shuffling off and staring at my feet. "But we'll get in trouble if someone finds out." "Don't be such a baby, Rick. No one's going to find out. Leon and I put together a plan. It's going to be fine." For a moment, I just stared at him. To say I didn't like Leo would have been an understatement. He was a city kid whose parents had moved away, but still owned a small vacation home in our town. Every summer, they spent their vacation out here, in our small, remote town. I first got to know Leo a year ago. When he arrived at the soccer field, he had this air of self-importance about him, and he made it clear he was much better than us small-town bumpkins. Yet, he and Eric bonded quickly, most likely because Leo was as energetic and full of bravado as Eric. "Why didn't you guys go already?" When I asked this, a different expression washed over Eric's face, and he looked away before he spoke again. "No way, you need at least 3 people or the beast's gonna get you." I rolled my eyes, but said nothing, It was clear he just made it up on the fly because he didn't want to admit he was worried about getting into trouble as well. A moment later, however, my curiosity was back, and I nodded energetically. You really sure no one's going to notice us? If my parents find out, I'll be grounded forever. Yeah, trust me. Only 10 minutes later, we arrived at a small vacation home. Without even waiting for me, Eric rushed toward the building and called out for his friend. Only a few seconds later, Leo made his way outside. He was a big boy, stout, and even at only a year older, much taller than me. I watched, half confused and half in awe, as the two of them greeted each other with a set of complicated hand signs. Hey, Leo, I said, and tried my best to reciprocate their hand signs, but failed miserably. It prompted nothing but a scoff from Leo before he turned back to Eric. Then he opened his backpack and showed Eric all the goods, as he called it. I watched as Eric's eyes grew wide, but before I could see anything, Leo had already closed his backpack again. Oh, let's head out, he said in an over-exaggerated tone of voice and pointed towards the distant woods. Wait, what's the plan? Leo turned to me with a heavy sigh, but soon he and Eric outlined their plan. It was simple, but clever enough, at least for a bunch of kids. We'd make our way to one of the nearby cornfields, and then, hidden between the heavy stalks, we'd approach the woods. That way no one would be able to see us. Finally, the three of us set out. Eric and I left our bikes right there before we followed a dirt path that led to the cornfields. Then we pushed ourselves between the heavy stalks, but made sure to stay near the edge. As we walked on, Eric and Leo began talking about the beast, and soon they shared their very own version of the story with me. Okay, Rick, this has to stay between the three of us, but Leo and I figured out what the beast really is. Eric started, giving me his best impression of a secretive face. Then he gave Leo a nod, who took a deep breath before he started to talk in a pretend ominous voice. So, the Jensen family, the ones who owned the boarding house? Before they ran off, they tortured and murdered all sorts of people. It's because they were part of this cult. Did these rituals to get magical power and whatnot. But one day, something went wrong. The youngest son of the family turned into a monster. They locked him up in the basement and out of fear, fled the town. After years, he escaped, and now roams the woods driven by nothing but rage and hunger. I listened, but even at 8 years old, I realized it was nothing but an amalgamation of bits and pieces from various other stories and urban legends. Yet the two of them went on and recited it as gospel. The longer they continued, the more ridiculous their story became. To them, the beast was as tall as a tree, a shapeshifter, but also a cannibal, and even had magical powers. In their version, the beast hadn't just killed a few people, but was responsible for hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths in the area. Before long, I stopped listening to their superfluous tale. But my belief in the beast itself never wavered. After a while, however, I wondered where we were even going. Guys, shouldn't we be near the woods by now? We're almost there, Leo answered. Are you sure we're going in the right direction? I went on. The two of them stopped, and I could see the annoyed look on Leo's face. Let's check how far we are, Eric said, and a moment later he pushed himself through the stalks. I followed him right away, and a moment later Leo set out after us. Eric stepped out of the field and onto a dirt path. I watched as his eyes wandered around, scanning the area. Leo and I were about to follow him when a voice reached us. Anderson, is that you? Eric froze. His eyes grew wide, and in an instant he jerked around and dashed back between the stalks. Didn't I tell you to stay out of my damn fields? And who's that with you over there? Instantly, the two of us booked it, leaving whoever the angry farmer was behind. Shit, Eric called out. It's Miller. He owns the fields up there. He once caught me and Jerry building a hideout in there. He said we'd be in for it if we ever did it again. As we ran, we could still hear the farmer's angry voice. But before long, it grew more distant. The man didn't seem intent on following us into the field. Eventually, we came to a halt, panting and utterly exhausted. You guys said no one would know. We're going to be in so much trouble. Look, Rick, Eric started. None of that matters. We're going to be heroes. Yeah, it's not like we did anything bad, Leo chimed in. I opened my mouth to protest, but I could see their faces. They were hungry for adventure, but also more than a bit annoyed at me. Under this assault, I felt cornered, pressured, and eventually I nodded. For what must have been another 10 minutes, we continued through the cornfield, before we finally reached the edge of the woods. Once more, Eric was about to rush out, but I stopped him. We gotta make sure it's clear. For a few seconds, he just stared at me before he understood and nodded. We carefully pushed apart the last few stalks and scanned the area beyond the field. The only thing that divided us from the forest was another small dirt path, and a dozen meters of grass. Once we were sure no one was around, we dashed out of the field as fast as our legs would carry us, and right before the first of many trees. The moment we did, a flock of birds, startled by our appearance, flew away, flapping their wings wildly. I froze and fear washed over me. For a second, I expected the ridiculous, towering creature the two of them had described to come for us and tear us apart. When I looked around, though, I saw how normal and non-threatening the woods actually were. I'd been in the woods before, many times, but because of all these terrible tales about the beast, my mind had transformed them into a dark, spiderweb-covered thicket. Now that I was back, I saw that they still comprised nothing but freestanding birch trees, and the occasional clump of evergreens. Yet, we still didn't dare to move. We all searched for signs of the beast, and for movement of any kind. Eric's eyes darted around as he scanned the trees, his face distorted by a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. After long moments of crouching between bushes, we finally set out deeper into the woods. By now, Leo's aloof attitude and even Eric's bravado had evaporated, and all talk about the beast had ceased. I could tell how antsy they were, because I felt exactly the same. We were all wondering if there really was some creature out here, if it was nearby, and what we'd do if it came for us. Before long, Eric used nothing but hand signs to tell us where to go and when to stop. He interjected between pointing ahead and raising his fist, almost as if we were soldiers in the middle of a war zone. In the meantime, Leo had pulled a huge hunting knife from his backpack, one much too big for a kid our age. Whenever we passed a tree, he cut a big X into its bark. When I stared at him, he turned to me. "An escape path, so we can find our way back," he told me in a short-bound whisper. I nodded vehemently. The two of them really had it all planned out. Suddenly, the two of them put their heads together, whispering to one another. "Guys, what's up?" I asked, pushing myself between them. "We heard something up there," Eric said, his head jerking in my direction. "What?" I asked, growing more anxious by the second, and my legs growing weaker. "By those stones over there," Leo added. With that, he pointed out a small rock formation to our right. Carefully, the three of us crossed the few meters of forest floor and underbrush. As I pushed myself on, step by step, my heart began beating heavy in my chest and my palms were growing sweaty. I told myself over and over again that these stones were much too small to hide any sort of towering monstrosity. Then I thought back to what the two of them had told me about the beast, that it was some sort of shapeshifter. What if... My thoughts were cut off when something shot out from between the rocks. A surprised, high-pitched scream escaped my mouth, and I stumbled back, bumping right into Eric. For a moment, I thought the beast had found us and would drag us away. Then I saw it was nothing but a rabbit, which instantly shot away. The breath I'd been holding escaped in a long exhale before I sighed audibly. Behind me, Leo snickered, and when I turned around, I found both him and Eric grinning at me. "Oh my God, Rick, your face. All because of a bunny?" Eric said. "It's not funny," I snapped at him. "It totally is. You screamed like a little girl," Leo added, laughing. "You're dumb. I bet you guys were as scared as I was," I mumbled, feeling utterly embarrassed about the whole thing. "Was not," Eric retorted. "But if that really was the beast, you'd be dead by now." When he said this, Leo began laughing again. "Whatever, shut up." The two of them were still grinning like idiots, and I was still embarrassed, but before long we continued on. All the while, however, Leo was still grinning at me. More than once he made snide remarks when he noticed birds, rabbits, or other small animals nearby. Even worse, I could see Eric trying his best not to laugh at those stupid jokes. Eventually, I grew too upset to take it anymore. You know what? This is dumb. I should have known the beast isn't real, just like Jerry said. The two of them turned to me. Eric was still overly excited, and Leo was still holding his dumb knife, marking trees without rhyme or reason. My remark was sacrilege. I dared to question the beast's existence. Instantly, both of them grew angry. You're just scared, you little baby. Leo laid into me. Eric, however, ignored him and took an angry step toward me. So you think it's made up too? What if I call for the beast and tell it to come and eat you? Fine, go ahead. Not like anything's gonna happen, I retorted, growing angry myself. I could see Eric's face distort, unsure about what to do when his threat didn't work. In an onset of annoyance, he bit his lip before he turned around and stomped on, deeper into the woods. He'd barely crossed a few meters when he stumbled over something and crashed to the ground. I heard him call out in pain and was about to laugh, but then I saw his eyes grow wide. Guys? Was all he said. Instantly, we were all serious again. And a moment later, Leo and I were right by his side. What Eric had stumbled over was the edge of a hole, one which was hidden below branches and leaves. I watched as Eric bent down to pick something up that had been stuck between the stones around the hole. It was a dirty piece of clothing, one caked in something dark and reddish-brown. It's gotta be blood, Eric said. Leo and I were both quiet, and I simply stared at the piece of clothing. My doubts about the beast having been nothing but a story evaporated. This piece of clothing, it was proof that the man had been out here, that something had happened to him, and that some sort of creature was really roaming the woods. The beast was real, after all. Anxiously, my eyes wandered from the piece of clothing to the trees and bushes around us. We should... I started, but when I turned back, Eric wasn't focused on the woods, but on the hole he'd stumbled over. He was busy tearing aside branches and leaves, revealing more and more of the hole until it was uncovered. Leo joined him in checking it out, and soon both of them were staring down into the darkness. The body, what if it's down there? Leo asked, turning to Eric. Still frozen, I could only watch them, my young mind going haywire with implications. The branches and leaves hiding it, the piece of clothing stuck to the rock. What if this hole, this place, was the beast's lair? You want to check it out? Eric suggested, his voice suddenly much more reserved, even anxious. A moment later he turned to me, as if waiting for me to say something. Anything. Instead, I could only stare at the looming darkness that seemed to spread out from the hole below us. Leo, however, was already busy trying to find a safe way down. As he did, parts of the forest floor and even some stones fell into the hole. I don't think it's deep. We should be... His voice trailed off, and he suddenly backed away from the hole. At first, I didn't know why. But then I heard it. Sounds. Sounds that were quickly growing louder. For a moment, my eyes darted around again, but we were still alone. Then those sounds, they had to be coming from down there. With each passing second, they grew louder, almost as if something was moving down there. Something big. And it was moving toward us. Then we all heard it. The sound of growling, and something slithering through whatever cavern lay below us. A second later, we all saw it. Deep down in the darkness, a set of glowing yellow eyes stared up at us. Instantly, Leo jumped to his feet, pushed past me and Eric, and ran. It's the beast! Rick, the beast! Eric called out, and we both dashed right after Leo. I was out of it. All my curiosity had been replaced by fear, by panic, by the realization that we were in actual, real danger. I dashed through the woods madly, but could still hear it behind us. Something making its way out of the hole. I heard the sounds of birds taking flight, of underbrush being torn away. Oh God. It was coming for us. It was coming for us. Eric and Leo were both faster than me, and I realized, with tears bursting from my eyes, that the beast was going to get me. I'd be the one to be taken away. I watched as Leo vanished behind a clump of evergreens, only to appear again a moment later. His face was as white as a sheet. He stumbled backwards, his hands shaking, one of them still closed around the knife. His eyes, however, were focused on something in front of us. Something behind those evergreens I couldn't see. The beast, I thought. The beast had overtaken us, and now we were cornered. Eric in front of me had stopped, his eyes focused on Leo and the trees in front of him. My legs, too, grew weak, and my steps slowed to a mere trot as despair overtook me. And then something pushed itself past the trees and built itself up in front of Leo, effortlessly swatting the hand holding the hunting knife aside. Leo was a stout boy, big for his age, but he was still dwarfed by the hulking monstrosity in front of him. I saw long, dangling limbs, bloody fur, claws, wild hair, and wide eyes. Wide, angry eyes. Then I screamed. "You goddamn... What the hell do you think you're doing out here? And what do you think you're doing with that knife?" The beast bellowed at Leo. Then the illusion was broken, and what I thought to be a giant monstrosity turned out to be nothing but an old man. An angry old man wearing dirty work clothes and carrying a hunting rifle on his back. For a second longer, his angry eyes rested on Leo, before they found me and Eric. Right at that moment, Leo, who'd slowly backed away from the old man, turned around and ran. In an instant, Eric tried to do the same thing, but before he could, the old man got a hold of him. "Oh, no, you don't. And you over there, not another move," he added, quickly turning to me. "Why the hell are you boys out here, waving knives around and whatnot? You got no goddamn business being out here." While he screamed at us, I was still indecisive about what to do, and still considered running. Yet I suddenly noticed the old man's eyes. They weren't focused on us, but on the trees behind us. In an instant, I jerked around, but all I saw was old birch trees. The beast," Eric, who'd finally found his voice again, said. "We found a hole, and there was blood," he rambled on. A moment later, he held up the bloody piece of clothing we'd found. In an instant, the old man snatched it from him. "Goddamn kids," he screamed, making me cringe. "This ain't no blood. There's no such thing as the beast. It's all stupid stories and rumors. Nothing else. Never was." "But something came after us and..." I started, but before I could continue, the old man let go of Eric and crossed the distance between us. "Now you listen well. Nothing came after you. Heard you screaming and causing a ruckus out here. Tried to tell you to knock it off, but you ran. There's an investigation going on out here, for Christ's sake. And here you are messing it all up." "But those sounds, they came from that hole," Eric protested. "Yeah, and I saw those eyes. They were staring right at us," I added. One look from the old man shut us both up. Then he shook his head and laughed. "Jesus Christ, kids these days. Can't even tell when they see a damn fox in a foxhole. That's all you saw. Trusting those stories about monsters and whatnot. Heh." A second later, he got a hold of me, dragged me over toward Eric, and focused on the both of us with wide, angry eyes. "Now you get the hell out of here. And I'll dare you, if I ever catch you or your friend with that knife out here again. I swear, boys, next time." As he said this, I watched his enormous hands open and close threateningly. In an instant, my fear was back. But now it was fear of this ghastly old man. At that moment, I thought there really was a beast out here. A beast in the form of an old man. "What are you waiting for? Scram!" he screamed, and instantly the two of us dashed away. After only a few moments, we reached the edge of the woods, and realized just how close to town we'd been. Where we arrived, however, couldn't be more fitting. It was right next to the Jensen boarding house. I would later learn that the old man we'd encountered was named Mr. Hubert, or Old Hubert, as we came to call him. He owned one of the local cattle farms and lived right next to the old boarding house. After Mr. Jensen and his family had abandoned the place, he'd taken it upon himself to become its new caretaker. I didn't know it then, but Old Hubert was a man I'd clash with time and again in the years and decades to come. Needless to say, Eric and I were utterly scared of him. As we went on our way back to the vacation home of Leo's family, neither of us said a word. Not about what we'd seen, not about Old Hubert, and not about Leo, who'd abandoned us. Instead, we got on our bikes and left without as much as saying goodbye to Leo. After Eric and I returned home from our little adventure, it didn't take long for our parents to find out about it. Mr. Miller had seen us in the cornfield, and had promptly contacted Eric's parents. And there was, of course, Old Hubert, who made it no secret about some of the local kids having been in the woods, and about one of them waving a huge hunting knife around. I got a stern talking to and was grounded for weeks. My parents made it clear that should I so much as look in the direction of the woods again, there was even more trouble coming. Leo must have gotten it even worse, especially since he'd taken his father's old hunting knife and almost attacked old Hubert. His family left a few days later, and the next year they didn't return, and never would again. For days I was troubled about what had happened in the woods, and what I'd seen. Yet, when I talked to my parents, they told me there was no such thing as monsters or beasts. Eventually, I simply accepted old Hubert's story. At night, however, things were different, and terrible nightmares haunted my sleep. Most of them centered on old Hubert, him turning into a monster and dragging us away. In some, however, I found myself back in front of that hole again, staring into the darkness below. Every single time I did, I saw more than just eyes. Below them, in the darkness, there was a grinning mouth. A mouth too wide, too big to be that of a fox or any other woodland animal. A mouth that almost could have been that of a human being. Eric and I didn't tell Jerry what had happened that day, and we never talked about the missing hiker or the beast again. Our interests, however, never strayed far, and instead shifted to the place the creature had supposedly originated from. The Jensen boarding house. The more stories I heard, and the more rumors reached my ears, the more fascinated I grew with the Jensen boarding house. Obsessed, even. I scurried our small town in search of stories, and for more information about the place. In the months following our adventure in the woods, I learned various things about the old building. It had been constructed a long, long time ago, long before our town was even founded. Some even said it was the reason people settled in the area. Yet the building hadn't always been the giant monstrosity that now loomed at the edge of town. All throughout its existence, if you can trust the stories, it was a place of perpetual change. What started out as nothing but a small lodging at a crossroads was extended countless times as the number of visitors and settlers in the area increased. It wasn't the old boarding house's origins, however, that interested me, but the stories and rumors related to its abandonment more than 3 decades ago, and what some called the Jensen family's flight from town. One such tale morphed Mr. Jensen, and by extension the members of his family, into a gruesome murderer, who'd killed countless travelers in cold blood, and who'd hidden their bodies in the depths of the old boarding house, adding them to the building's foundation. When his deeds were uncovered, he and his family fled town. Another gruesome tale changed things around, and made Mr. Jensen and his family the victims of a nasty group of travelers. What the men did to the family, Fred, a local teenager, told me, was so terrible that not even the police dared to mention it. Instead, they made up the entire story of the family leaving town. If you entered the old boarding house, though, and you made your way down to the furthest, darkest depths of the basement, you'd still find the family's broken and battered bones down there. Yet these tales were only the tip of the iceberg, and the most normal of the rumors and legends surrounding the old boarding house. As a child, I was more interested in the more outlandish and twisted tales. My favorites were those about cultish activities and devil worshipping. Our town is Christian, always has been. The Jensen family, it was said, had been rather reclusive, and never partook in any of the town's Christian activities. They supposedly frowned on such practices, and were involved in other, more heretical ones. It was none other than Jerry's cousin who'd heard rumors about the family having made pacts with demons, or even the devil himself. The boarding house had been nothing but a front, one to lure in unsuspecting victims for their disgusting, evil blood rituals. Outwardly, it was a place of merriment, but in reality, it was one of ritualistic sacrifice. He'd even heard that they committed their rituals up in the building's high attic, and even now, on certain days, you could hear the victims' pained moans. For they buried their remains right there, sealed them away in the building's walls, and made them a part of the cursed place forever. There were many more stories, many far more outlandish. Stories about the old boarding house itself being alive, of secret military experiments, of aliens and hidden laboratories. Even as a kid, however, I knew they were nothing but nonsense. What all the stories agreed upon, though, was that bad things had happened at the Jensen boarding house, and that there was much more to the family who owned the place. Before long, my hunger for information drove me to even pester my parents. My father, being the rational man he was, shrugged off all rumors, calling it nothing but silly stories to create a bit of history for our town. My mother, on the other hand, wouldn't have any of it. All these stories about death and murder, she said, were not something a boy my age should talk about, let alone be interested in. So I assured her I'd give up on it, and never talk to her about the old place again. The only person I could still talk to about it was my grandpa. He was more than happy to share his old tales with me. But they were always happy ones, about the good old days, as he called them. He told me the old boarding house had been the place he'd met my grandma during one of the annual dances. She had been the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen. He also told me about the many evenings he and his friends went there to play cards, and even shared some misdeeds they'd committed after a few too many drinks. They were tales about Wilfred, who always cheated and won the pot, or the time his late friend Matthew, Jerry's grandfather, got in a fistfight with a guy hoping to woo a girl. Grandpa was my only confidant in all the rumors and stories I heard about the old boarding house, and I was hoping to get more details, or at least a different angle. Yet he'd only ever laugh about the outlandish tales we kids shared amongst each other. When I asked him why the old boarding house was abandoned, he merely shrugged.
The place didn't earn its share anymore, you know? They built that bar down the road and the new dance hall up on Foster Street. People just didn't go to the old boarding house anymore. I guess Mr. Jensen just gave up on both the boarding house and the town.
But what about all the stories, Grandpa? The murders, the monsters, and...
It's all humbug, Ricky. Nothing else. None of that ever happened. That's just what people do. Make up stories. Make up rumors.
This, however, didn't deter me, and I continued to annoy him about anything related to the old boarding house, and he humored my interests. One day, however, I mentioned something that made Grandpa look up. The things in the walls. He asked me to repeat what I just said, and when I did, he became serious, and a contemplative look came over his face. For a few moments he was quiet, before he asked me where I'd heard it. I said it was hearsay from some of the other kids in town, one of them Joshua Miller, who swore his great-uncle used those exact words. Once more, Grandpa became quiet, the thoughtful expression on his face not wavering. Eventually, he leaned back on our old garden bench, sighed, and began to talk.
That's an old story. A dumb one at that, he started. One of my friends teased me with it for years, he added, laughing. The things in the walls, yes. I think it all started because of the constant noises. Now, Ricky, the boarding house, it's a huge building, and an old one. Even when I was younger. There are always rats somewhere in old buildings. Always.
But Grandpa, I cut in. What about the corpses? I mean, I heard the Jensens murdered people and sealed their bodies away in the walls. So maybe those noises...
Now, Ricky, enough with that humbug.
Grandpa interrupted me.
You want to hear this old man's stories, or do you not?
When he castigated me like that, I pouted for a bit. Then he tousled my hair, and I began laughing, and soon nodded.
There was this one kid by the name of Big George. He was a bit on the dumber side, not right in the head, you know?
I gave Grandpa a questioning look, and was about to say something, but then I kept my mouth shut.
Now, back in the day, whenever Matthew, Wilfred, and I were there to play cards, so was Big George. He always wanted to join in. Like them pictures, you know? The kings, the queens, the jacks, but got confused by the numbers. I couldn't keep 'em up and got frustrated. There was one thing the big fool was good at, though. Drinking. And he was damn good at it, much to the disdain of his mother. Poor woman always had to come in the next day to cover his tab, cursing about that good-for-nothing son of hers. And every single night he was back. One evening we were playing cards as usual, and as usual Wilfred was winning. The old crook was cheating again, of course, but he was too clever to be caught red-handed. Matthew was getting mad, the girls were laughing, and even I'd grown frustrated. I went to get myself another drink, and there he was. Big George just standing there, mug in hand, staring at the wall. While my friends were arguing, I stepped up to the big guy. I asked him what was wrong, if he'd had a few too many. I remember it even now. "Them things are back," he said. I asked him what he meant. I remember laughing a little, thinking he was drunk out of his mind. "Them things in the walls," he answered, not even looking at me. I wondered if he was talking about rats, and told him they might have built a nest in the walls. When I said this, he finally turned to look at me. Now, Big George, as I said, he was a tad bit slow. I always had this droopy look on his face, half empty, as if he wasn't really there, especially when he had a few too many. That day, the big fella's face was different, tense, serious, but most of all, anxious. I stepped up to him, put my hand on his shoulder, trying to tell him the rats wouldn't come out. He needn't be scared of them. I only heard him mumble a single thing, though. Not rats, but them people behind the walls. He said it so quietly I wasn't sure I'd heard it right. I couldn't help but laugh again, wondering if he was just trying to scare me, but his expression was still the same. Said he knew what I was thinking. The big doofus was lying again, making up stories to scare people. But he swore he was not. Swore it by the Lord himself. Even said he saw one of them, back by the shitter. Said there's that hole in the wall, and from there, one of them was staring at him. Now, I tried my best to calm the big fella down. Told him it had probably been a rat, one of the big fat ones like those muskrats down by the pond. When I said this, the sounds in the wall seemed to grow louder. Sounded as if something was moving in there, right in front of us. Rustling and grinding against mortar and brick. Couldn't help but shiver. I told myself it was all humbug, and because of the big fella's talk about people behind the walls. And by that point, Matthew and Wilfred were almost at each other's throats. Damn idiots they were. Matthew screaming at him for cheating, always cheating and taking his hard-earned money, while Wilfred had this big grin on his face, taunting him, asking what he was going to do about it. I was about to walk over and tell him to knock it off, but Mr. Jensen had already noticed the argument, and promptly told all three of us we'd had enough and get lost. Cursed down the rest of my beer and followed him to the door. All the while, Big George still stood there, still staring at the wall. I heard him whisper, "Go away," over and over again. Was about to start my way home when nature called. Knew it was a long way back, so I made my way down the hall to the toilet. And Big George's words came back to me. I called myself stupid. He even laughed a little, drunk as I was. Then I heard them noises again. The rustling and the grinding. Now I knew damn well there's no people in the walls, and that it had to be rats or other rodents, but still got scared. Looked around, saw the hole the big fella had talked about. It was up in the corner where the wallpaper had been torn. The sound was coming from right there. It was growing louder by the second. It sounded as if something was trying to make its way out. And then I saw it. Two big, wide eyes staring down at me, filling out almost the entire hole. I saw them only for a moment, but I remember thinking, those are no rat's eyes. No. Began cursing at myself for getting scared, but right then, a big damn rat jumped from the hole, a big fat one of them muskrats. Landed on my shoulder, crashed on my lap, squeaking before it scrambled away. Screamed like a little girl, jumped off the toilet and booked it. Wasn't even done with my business. Got my pants all wet as I rushed from the building. Matthew was long gone, but Wilfred had been waiting for me. And when he noticed the stains, he burst out laughing. Told him a damn rat had jumped me and it's had him reeling again. Joined in with him soon enough. Was drunk after all. And I was sure the big fella's talk had put ideas in my head. Things in the walls. people behind them. All humbug.
Yet, as Grandpa finished the story, an expression of doubt washed over his face. One that told me his words were as much to deter Big George's story as they were to reassure himself. "What happened to Big George, Grandpa?" I asked, wondering why I'd never heard of someone like that before.
One day the big fella died. Fell over just like that. A heart attack, they said. You see, Ricky, his body was a bit wrong. So it was only a matter of time until something like that would have happened. It was out in the woods. He was helping with the forest work, carrying logs and whatnot. And his heart just stopped.
I listened intently, and now I had so many questions in my mind. So many questions I wanted to ask. Before I could, though, Grandpa got up from the bench.
It's all just that, Ricky. Old stories. Nothing but stories. Everything. Big George, the card games, the drinking, and the old boarding house, too.
Oh, how wrong Grandpa was. The boarding house might have been old, but the stories, they weren't. And new rumors and tales were added to the ever-growing number almost every year. And before long, I'd have my very own stories to tell about the Jensen boarding house. As Eric, Jerry, and I grew older, we transitioned from dumb kids to even dumber young teens. Incidentally, our fear and respect for the Jensen boarding house was replaced by an ever-growing curiosity. It felt almost as if the place was luring us in, enticing us to get ever closer, and to be the ones to finally uncover the root of its many mysteries. The first time we set foot into the overgrown yard surrounding the building, a stern voice told us to get lost. It belonged to none other than old Hubert, the ghastly old man Eric and I had encountered in the woods. When the two of us recognized him and saw his angry face, we booked it instantly, followed by a more than confused Jerry. Once we'd made it a safe distance away, we reluctantly shared our adventure in the woods with him, as well as our first encounter with the old man. We thought Jerry would have laughed and made fun of us, but his face grew serious. "You know, you're not the first kids to run into him out there," he finally said. In an instant, Eric and I pressed him to tell us more. "You know Mark and Daniel, the Robertson twins, right? They were out in the woods like a year ago, building a hideout when he found them. Daniel said he chased them all the way back to town, screaming at them they had no business being out there. They were so afraid they never went back. I think Mark even lost his Game Boy out there." "But why? It's not like those are his woods, are they?" I asked. "Maybe he just hates kids. I mean, he lives out here all on his own," Jerry suggested.
"I bet he hates everyone,"
Eric snapped. Before long, we uncovered that old Hubert, similar to the old boarding house, was surrounded by a fair share of rumors himself. While he indeed lived alone, and took care of his cattle all by himself, he'd once been married and even had a daughter. One day, however, they vanished. Some people said he cared more about his animals. Some said he was a violent man, a drunk, and drove them away. There are others, however, who suggested something far more sinister might have happened. The moment we heard this, Eric was convinced that he must have murdered them and hidden their bodies in the old boarding house. These tales, and our fear of the old man, could only deter our lust for adventure, secrets, and mystery for so long. Eventually, it drove us back to the old boarding house, and, conquering our fears, we snuck into the yard again. This time, however, we were careful to remain out of old Hubert's sight. We were more than curious by that point, half mad from all the tales we'd shared with one another, and desperate to find out more about the Jensen boarding house, maybe to even find a way inside. We were never courageous enough to approach the building's front door, but even its windows were securely locked. Even worse, after only a few minutes on the property, old Hubert would inevitably notice us and chase us away, cursing at us in his stern, raspy voice. One day, Eric had had enough, and, being the fearless idiot he was, he decided to make his way into the building one way or another. Of course, without telling me or Jerry a single thing about what he'd planned. It was the early evening, and like so many other times before, we carefully approached the old boarding house. We reasoned old Hubert wouldn't discover us during the hours of twilight, given the overgrown state of the yard. At least, not anytime soon. At first, we hid between the bushes at the edge of the yard and kept our eyes open for any signs of the ghastly old man. When we saw all was clear, we continued on, half crawling between the high grass, and made our way to the building's walls. That day, we were more daring than ever before, and for the first time, we approached the main entrance. When we tried to open it, though, we found it securely locked, and however much we tried, the door wouldn't budge. Then Eric approached a window, rummaged through his backpack, and brought out a screwdriver.
"Wait, what are you trying to do?"
I asked in a whisper.
"If we open it, we can get inside,"
he answered, already checking the window frame. He found a set of old, rusty screws holding it in place, but soon realized he couldn't move them. Cursing, he began to tinker with the hinges, trying to push the screwdriver's top under them to pry them open. Meanwhile, Jerry and I had our eyes glued to the surrounding yard, watching out for old Hubert, and expecting him coming for us at any moment.
"All right, here goes nothing,"
Eric said suddenly from behind us. Before we knew it, the sound of breaking glass reached us. We both turned to him in stunned panic and saw that Eric, in his frustration, must have picked up a stone and broken the window. He had been smart enough not to throw it, and yet the sound still echoed endlessly over the yard, and seemed to spread over the entire town.
"Guys, what are you doing? Help me clear the glass,"
he snapped at us while he cleared the remaining shards. Then Jerry and I saw him. In the twilight, his entire body seemed different. Longer. Thinner. Almost insectile. His shadow was warped to gigantic proportions, preceding him and already reaching out for us. Old Hubert. The moment he saw what Eric had done, his steps came to a halt. I saw how he balled his hands into fists, and how his face contorted and changed color. For a single lonely second, he didn't move, and seemed to be taken aback by the affront Eric had committed. Then he moved again, like a predator ready to pounce on his prey, and came rushing forward.
"What the hell do you think you're doing?"
he screamed at us. In an instant, Jerry and I were running, fleeing from the approaching abomination that was old Hubert.
"Eric, it's old Hubert,"
I called out to him. But when I turned around, I saw that he'd been too slow, had been in the process of climbing through the window. He'd barely jumped down when the old man's giant paw of a hand closed around his arm. Even now, so many years later, I remember his terrified shrieks, and his begs for help as he struggled against the old man's unrelenting grip. Yet, Jerry and I didn't stop running. We couldn't. We'd seen the anger, the rage on his face, had seen his balled fists, and knew we couldn't be caught by him. No, we both knew the moment we stopped, he'd get us too, drag us away, and we'd share a fate similar to what awaited Eric. Yet, his fate was different from what we imagined. We thought that we'd never see Eric again, and that he'd be added to the list of the old boarding house's many victims, or he'd become another person lost in the woods. Instead, old Hubert dragged him, screaming and struggling, all the way to his home at the other end of town, and told his parents exactly what he'd done. In an angry tirade, he explained that the Jensen boarding house was under preservation order, that he'd taken up as the building's caretaker, and he saw it as his responsibility that it would stay the way it was. And yet, there were kids like Eric, who'd go around damaging the town's oldest, most famous building. It was a disgrace. He even told them in a few angry words that if he'd ever catch Eric doing something like that again, it wouldn't just end with a stern talking. Jerry and I fared little better. Old Hubert informed our parents about what had happened. I was told to stop bothering with the old boarding house once and for all, and was grounded for an entire month. Jerry ended up in a similar situation. This should have been a lesson for us, but month after month it drove us back there. We were still intent on solving whatever mysteries surrounded the place, and to prove that all the rumors were true. Yet we never dared to break anything again. Old Hubert saw us, of course, and he yelled at us to scram, but eventually he seemed content enough just to watch us, and to make sure we didn't damage the building. He seemed to know that we'd learned our lesson, and as much as he despised gawking children, was content with us roaming the yard. This change in behavior, however, had a distinct effect on us, one the old man must have intended all along. We lost interest. Our respect and fear for the building had long since dissipated, and its foreboding atmosphere was non-existent. Now, with old Hubert not even bothering to chase us away, the ghastly old boarding house was transformed into nothing but yet another building in town. Even worse, all we'd done for months was to sneak around the building, leaving no stone unturned. Yet we learned nothing new, and found no proof about any of the grisly tales we'd heard. Eventually, we just gave up on the old place, and instead did what so many others had done before us. We made up our own stories, our own rumors, and added them to the ever-growing number surrounding the Jensen boarding house. It would be more than 2 years before we approached the Jensen boarding house again. And, once again, it was because a new rumor made its way into town.
You guys, there's news!
Eric, who'd just met up with us, started. What news? I asked.
The boarding house,
he blurted out, panting, but was too out of breath to continue.
Let me guess, there's monsters in the basement?
Jerry asked jokingly. Yeah, or creepy scientists who create zombies in the attic? I suggested, similarly sarcastically. By now, whatever spell the place had held over us had long since dissipated. Jerry and I just weren't interested anymore. All the weird and ghastly tales we'd heard over the years were just that. Nothing but tales. Only Eric was still as taken by the rumors as he'd been years ago.
No, it's about the treasure,
he finally said. Wait, what treasure? I asked.
Well,
Eric started to explain with a knowing grin on his face.
You know Robbie, right? John's brother who goes to college?
We both nodded. Robbie had always been the smartest kid in town. Our local prodigy, you could say. A couple of years ago, John had invited us over, and we spent the afternoon watching Robbie build some sort of electronic device. It was nothing short of awe-inspiring. And after that, everything he said was gospel. So when we heard his name, we knew that whatever we were about to hear had to be the truth.
Okay, well, John told me Robbie found this old book at the library. It's about the history of our town. After the Jensen family arrived here, they constructed the boarding house and grew filthy fucking rich. They're the whole reason our town even exists. Back in the day, they owned pretty much half the businesses and most of the fields around town.
So? Jerry asked.
So, they must have had a lot of money, jewelry, and whatnot. You know how reclusive they were, right? I bet they never even put their money in the bank, just like old Lisbeth. Remember how they found all that cash hidden under her bed after she died? I bet the Jensens did the same thing, but when they abandoned the place, they left everything behind. I bet they
left all their money and treasure behind, too, I called out. Eric was quick to nod and continued on.
I bet that's why old Hubert keeps watch over the place and lets no one go inside. He wants all the treasure to himself.
And that's how it started. For the next hour, we continued talking about and conjuring up ideas of what sort of treasure might be hidden in the old building, why the Jensens had left the place behind, and, of course, old Hubert. It didn't take long for us to convince ourselves that he was the reason for all those ghastly rumors, and he was spreading them, so no one dared to approach the old boarding house. Before long, this renewed interest drove us right back there. The building was still exactly the same, almost as if it was perpetually frozen in time. Old Hubert saw us, of course, and he wasn't too pleased. By now, however, we were older, 13, and much more daring. Sure, he was still scary, but by now he was really just an old man. Our fear was diminished further when we noticed he must have gotten himself hurt, and now suffered from an almost perpetual limp.
Don't you kids dare make a ruckus. Leave the building alone, all right?
Sure thing, Mr. Hubert, Eric called back, snickering, but still weary not to let the old man notice. His cocky comment got him a disapproving look.
Don't you make me come over there, you hear me?
For the next couple of minutes, he continued watching us like a hawk, leaning on the sturdy fence dividing his farm from the old boarding house's yard. Eventually, though, he just shook his head and returned to a bench in front of his house. From there, he kept a watch over his animals, and seemed to only take the occasional glance at the old boarding house and its yard. This was our chance. We put the plan we'd hatched into motion right away. At first, we'd pretend to leave the building and its overgrown yard behind, before we'd approach it from a different direction, careful to remain out of the old man's sight. So, how do we get in? I asked.
We could break a window. I bet we'll be able to sneak inside before...
Jerry started.
No way.
Eric cut him off.
Old Hubert will find out and think it was me again. My dad's gonna beat the shit out of me.
Well, then what do you suggest? As the two of them argued, I got an idea. Why don't we try the front door again? There must be some way to open it. Moments later, we'd made it to the building's main entrance, and busied ourselves with the front door, trying to pry it open.
Hey, get away from there!
Old Hubert called out. We could already see him making his way toward us, face distorted by anger. Yet, we didn't run. Not anymore.
We're just having a look around. We're not doing anything,
Eric replied. The old man, however, didn't have any of it.
If you don't scram, I'm gonna...
Gonna do what, Mr. Hubert?
Gonna get us?
We'd all seen his pained face. We'd seen his limp. And we knew there was no way he'd be able to get us.
Oh no, I won't bother with any of that. I'm gonna call the police.
When we heard this, we all turned to him. The old man's face showed he was serious, and we knew instantly this wasn't a bluff. As if to threaten us further, he began pressing the buttons on a wireless phone while staring us down. It was enough to make us pick up our bikes and race away. Yet, we didn't give up so easily. We told ourselves that the old man couldn't be around all the time. As it turned out, we were wrong. It didn't matter when we arrived, the old man was always there, keeping a watchful eye on the old boarding house. It almost seemed as if he was waiting for us to arrive. Whenever he did, he'd not waste any time, and threatened us with the police again. It seemed he knew exactly what we were up to, and this only reinforced our beliefs about hidden treasure in the depths of the old boarding house. It wasn't long before we grew frustrated, and our carefulness was replaced by the same desperation that had spurred us on 2 years ago. We told ourselves we'd just break in after all. With his limp, old Hubert was nowhere near fast enough to catch us. If anything, we could barge inside, get the treasure, and make off with it before he'd be able to do anything. The trouble we'd get in? It would be more than worth it, we reasoned. As for the old man's threats, they were just that. Nothing but threats. We were only half right. Old Hubert was indeed too slow to catch us. That was true. What we were wrong about were his threats. We just made plans for our newest attempt at breaking in and set out. Our idea was simple. We'd do the same thing Eric had tried to do. Pry open a window without breaking the glass. Sure, it might take us a while, and maybe we'd have to come back multiple times, but eventually we'd succeed. We snuck toward the edge of the yard unseen, and waited for the old man to make his way back to the bench. Then we dashed toward a window on the building's backside, only to be greeted by someone else.
Well, boys, that's far enough.
It was Deputy Sheffield.
Don't you have anything better to do than cause trouble around the boarding house? Pester Mr. Hubert?
He yelled at us.
No, we were just passing by. Why are you even...
Eric started, but he was cut off.
Don't give me that bull, Anderson. I know damn well you've been sneaking around the building, Mr. Hubert's property, for weeks. Who do you think called me all the way out here? God damn it,
Eric cursed. At this point, we saw old Hubert, who watched the entire spectacle with an expression of purest delight on his face.
Told you I'd call the police,
he spat at us. Now then, Deputy Sheffield spoke up again.
I take it you understand the situation? This is my one and only warning. If I catch you here again, or so much as hear another word from Mr. Hubert, things won't be over so easily. You got me?
Yes, Jerry mumbled.
Shit, fine, all right,
Eric added. I said nothing. Instead, I stared at old Hubert, who seemed to stare right back at me, still wearing that same expression on his face.
Reeds?
Deputy Sheffield snapped at me and took a threatening step in my direction.
Are you deaf, or do I have to take you down to the station?
Right at that moment, Eric elbowed me, and I found myself face to face with an angry Deputy Sheffield, who was staring me down. Oh, yeah, sorry, Mr. Sheffield. I get it.
Well, get the hell out of here.
As we rushed to our bikes, Deputy Sheffield made his way over to Mr. Hubert. The two of them began talking, but as much as I strained my ears, I couldn't make out their conversation. What if they were whispering to one another? Right away, I convinced myself that Deputy Sheffield was in on it, and was paid off by the old man. Once I'd picked up my bike and was out in the streets, I looked back once more. Deputy Sheffield was on his way to his cruiser, still watching me. Old Hubert, however, hadn't moved one bit, and was now staring at the old boarding house again.
Hey, come on, Rick,
Eric called out. He and Jerry had already started down the street, and were already a good distance away. Hey, wait up, guys. With that, I jumped onto my bike and raced after them. At this point, we should have given up for good. With Deputy Sheffield involved, this was no laughing matter anymore. He was the worst cop in town. A real asshole. And even worse, he enjoyed being one. The moment I shared my suspicions about him, my friends wholeheartedly agreed. We were sure he was just waiting for a chance to take us in. And he'd do it with a big, fat smile on his face. At least, if old Hubert were around to inform him. For the next couple of weeks, we stayed clear of the old boarding house. Instead, we began stalking and keeping tabs on old Hubert. We tried to find out when the old man wasn't around, and when he was taking care of his animals. Yet it didn't matter how early or how late we arrived. He seemed to have already taken care of them, and just sat there on his bench watching the old boarding house all day. It was as if he knew we hadn't given up, and just waited for us to be back. We even saw Deputy Sheffield pull by his home occasionally, most likely to inquire if we'd been back or had caused any other trouble. A month later, something unexpected happened. Eric and I had been talking about a new plan, using some of the younger kids as scapegoats when Jerry spoke up. I talked to Bill, he mumbled, more to himself than to us. The moment the name left his mouth, both Eric and I stopped talking and turned toward him. What'd you say? Eric blurted. You told Bill? I added, not even a second later. Yeah, but it's not that I... What did you tell your brother about this? Eric laid into him. Are you crazy? He's gonna steal all the treasure and... What treasure? All we do is talk and talk and talk and watch old Hubert. Nothing ever happens. We're not doing anything. I'm just sick and tired of it. Jerry cursed in frustration. Guys, stop it, I cut in. Eric's head jerked in my direction, but instead of laying into me as well, he began pacing around, stomping the ground in sheer anger. He's not so bad, you know, Jerry mumbled. He said he's going to help us and take us along when he breaks in. Not so bad. He's a freaking junkie, Eric retorted. He's not. I mean, Jerry started, but then closed his mouth again. What Eric had said was true enough. Jerry's brother Bill was indeed an addict. Our town was small, but that didn't mean we didn't have our share of bad apples. And Jerry's brother was the worst of them. He'd always been a troublemaker, even as a child. But as he grew older, things only got worse. He'd spent half his adolescence absent from school, and not a month had passed without him getting into trouble with the police. His record included not only the possession, but also the trade of illegal substances, property damage, a failed robbery, and more than a handful of cases of assault, the first of which he'd committed at age 13. By now, his parents had kicked him out, and he lived in the town's social housing complex, where he spent his days with other similar characters. Everyone had given up on him. Everyone but Jerry, who still looked up to his brother to a worrying degree. Well, what's his idea then? Eric scoffed. Bill said we're stupid for trying to break in during the day. The old man has to sleep eventually, so, if anything, we should do it at night. That's great and all, I countered. But there's no way we can just sneak out in the middle of the night. My parents would kill me. That's what I told Bill. But he had an idea. He said we should stay over at some kid's place. Someone whose parents won't suspect a thing. Once everyone's asleep, we can sneak out. We both looked at him. Neither Eric nor I had ever thought of that. We had to admit it was a genius idea. Yeah, but who? Eric asked. I don't know. What about Joshua? Jerry suggested. What? You know his dad, right? The dude hates me. If he so much as sees me, he's gonna... Stephen Brown, I said, cutting off Eric's angry tirade. Both of them turned to me. Stephen? He's like 11. And annoying as hell. Yeah, but remember what he told us the other day? About his mom? Like she's always busy with her job, goes to bed early, so he can watch TV all night. What if he's lying? I mean, it is Stephen, Jerry protested. If he's right, though, then she won't notice a thing. Come on, guys, it's worth a try. I mean, we're talking about Stephen's mom here. I doubt she'll suspect a thing. You know, Eric finally said, nodding. At times, you're not a total idiot, Rick. Shut up, Eric. Soon enough, though, we were all laughing again. Only a day later, we approached Stephen. He and a few of the other younger kids were hanging out on the playground near the soccer field. The moment he saw us, he left them standing and raced toward us. We all knew Stephen was desperate for our approval. He always wanted to hang out with us and join us on our adventures. Yet none of us particularly liked him. He was an annoying know-it-all, and a crybaby pampered by his mother. Stephen, though, had no clue how much we disliked him, and was always happy to see us. We joined him and the other kids for a bit before we approached him about our idea. Me, specifically. Eric and Jerry had said I'd come up with it, so it fell to me to ask him. "So, Stephen," I started, feeling nervous under the watchful eye of my friends. "We're planning a sleepover, and we wanted to ask if you'd like to—"
"Oh my God, guys, that's an amazing idea!"
Stephen called out in an instant, his face distorted by an ecstatic grin.
"It's gonna be so awesome! We'll watch movies, play games, and—"
"Yeah, but, there's a problem." I cut him off, putting on my best impression of a sad face. "None of our parents will let us have it at our home, so—" My voice trailed off, giving him a hopeful look, praying he understood what I was hinting at.
"Oh,"
was all he said at first. But after a few seconds, his face lit up.
"Why don't we have it at my place? I'm sure my mom doesn't mind, and would be happy to have you all over."
"Sounds great," Eric said. "Want me to bring my PlayStation and some games?" Stephen's eyes grew wide. His mouth opened, and a surprised chuckle escaped from it. We all knew his mom couldn't afford to buy him any video games, and he soon nodded vehemently. The three of us smiled at each other. It seemed our plan would be a success.
"All right, guys, I'm going to go ask my mom right away. This is going to be awesome."
With that, he raced off toward his bike, and a moment later he was gone. As minute after minute ticked by, our initial hope slowly faded.
"I should have known this wouldn't work,"
Jerry mumbled. But right at that moment, I saw Stephen on the street.
You guys!
He called out to us before his bike came to a halt right in front of us.
"Mom said it's all right. You can all come over this weekend,"
he said with a giant grin on his face, giving us an over-exaggerated thumbs up. We did our best to return the gesture, but we could see Stephen was about to say something else. After a few seconds, eyes downcast, he opened his mouth again.
"Well, if you promise not to make too much of a ruckus."
We all rolled our eyes, but were quick to promise him that we wouldn't cause any trouble. For another couple of minutes, we humored him, and told him about all the awesome things we'd planned before we left a still bouncy, excited, and, most important of all, unsuspecting Stephen behind. For the next couple of days, all we did was make preparations for Operation Jensen Boarding House, as we referred to it. Jerry had informed his brother that the big day would be Saturday. We also made long lists of the things we'd need, including provisions, flashlights, and other tools we thought robbers or thieves usually used. We even planned an escape route, how and where to sell all the treasure, and of course, what we do with all the money. What can I say? We were typical teens. When my mom heard about the news, she was slightly taken aback, knowing that Stephen and I weren't exactly friends. I explained that Jerry had been hanging out with him and wanted us to tag along. I even admitted feeling sorry for Stephen, and eventually she relented. And so, on Saturday, in the early evening, all three of us met up in front of Stephen's home, backpacks filled with all the things we'd need for the night. Stephen's mom greeted us with a bright smile before she led us to his room. The moment she opened the door and Stephen saw us, he jumped off his bed, threw the comic book he'd been reading aside, and raced up to us.
"Oh my God, you guys are finally here. It's gonna be so awesome."
Then his head jerked toward Eric.
"Did you bring your PlayStation?"
he half screamed in his excitement. Eric nodded and brought out the console, which Stephen promptly snatched from his hands and put down in front of his small TV.
"How do you hook it up?"
he asked, shuffling around in his excitement. His mom laughed as she watched her son's reaction. "Now, boys, don't spend all evening playing video games, all right? Also, who's up for some snacks?" We all said we were, and, laughing once more, she left the room. Looking back, I feel terrible about the whole thing. We didn't care one bit about Stephen, yet both he and his mom were genuinely excited for us to be there. I can't help but wonder if this was the first time Stephen had had friends over, and if he'd had any real friends at all. It wasn't long before his mom returned with a tray full of sandwiches and other snacks. By now, Eric and Stephen were already playing a racing game. "Boys," she started after placing the tray on Stephen's desk. We all turned to her. I'll be going to bed soon. I don't mind you staying up late, but not all night, okay? This applies specifically to you, Steven. Sure, Mom, Steven called out and turned back to the game. The rest of us nodded dutifully. His mother gave another brief laugh before she left the room again. Steven had been right. As happy as she was, the woman looked terribly exhausted. For the next hour, we all took turns playing games with Steven. And once we weren't in the mood anymore, we let him play one of Eric's beat-em-up games to keep him busy. In the meantime, the three of us huddled together, whispering to one another.
So, what did Bill say? He said he's going to text me around midnight. You sure he's going to show up?
I asked.
Yeah, Bill would never leave me hanging.
At that, Eric scoffed, but said nothing. As the hours ticked by, we soon noticed Steven nodding off in front of the TV. A look at Jerry's phone told us it was 11:30.
Any word yet?
Eric nudged Jerry.
Nothing. Hold on, I'll text him.
With that, Jerry sent Bill a quick text. A couple of minutes later, his phone vibrated. He'd barely taken it out when Eric and I squeezed ourselves next to him, staring at the screen. Geez, little bro, why are you so eager? I'm going to hang with the guys for a bit longer, but I'll be there around 2, he wrote.
2? It's almost 3 hours,
Eric snapped.
What's almost 3 hours?
A tired Steven asked, rubbing his eyes. All three of us jerked around. Steven yawned, but seemed surprised by the shocked look on our faces.
What's going on?
Eric, next to me, mouthed a quiet, "Oh shit." "Oh, the game we just talked about, there's a super hard level that takes like 3 hours to beat," Jerry blurted out.
Really? What game?
Steven asked, yawning again. Eric gave Jerry a panicked look before he rummaged through his backpack. Eventually, he found an RPG and held it out for Steven to see.
This one's dungeon's super hard. I died like 1,000,000 times trying to beat it,
Eric rambled. Instead of playing along, I tried a different tactic.
Come on, guys, it's almost midnight. Shouldn't we go to sleep? I'm tired,
I said, forcing myself to yawn. When Steven heard this, he jerked up.
No way, I'm not tired at all. I just dozed off for a second. Hold on, I have an idea.
With that, he jumped to his feet. Where are you going? I asked, surprised when I saw him make his way to the door.
Coffee,
he exclaimed, giving us another one of his over-exaggerated thumbs up. Didn't your mom tell you not to make a ruckus? What if she wakes up?
No way. Mom takes these weird pills before bed. She never wakes up until morning.
I don't know what it was about this sentence, but even years later, it still haunts me, and fills me with the deepest regret about everything to come that night. A moment later, Steven rushed out of the door, and we soon heard him rummaging in the kitchen.
Shit, what do we do now?
Jerry asked.
We can just let him play the dumb game, right? I'm sure he'll fall asleep again soon,
Eric answered. I nodded and set up the game. Then we waited for him to return. When he did, he was balancing 4 large cups in his hands, wearing an enormous grin on his face. He quickly handed them out to us, and I saw they were filled to the brim with thick, black coffee. I carefully took a sip and cringed. I'd drank coffee before, but never any as strong and bitter as this. Eric and Jerry showed a similar reaction. Steven, however, beamed at us.
I know it's disgusting, but with that we won't get tired until morning. We can stay up all night and play games.
I got another worried look from my friends and shot them back an annoyed one of my own. What the hell did they want me to do? For the next hour, Steven continued playing the RPG we'd chosen for him, while the three of us watched him absent-mindedly. When he asked if we wanted to take turns, we told him it was more fun to watch him play. In reality, the three of us were antsy, shuffling around, waiting desperately for him to grow tired. Yet, the coffee had done its deed. Steven was wide awake, hyper even. With each passing minute, I realized we were in serious trouble. While Steven was fighting a boss, oohing and awing, the three of us put our heads together.
Shit, what do we do?
Jerry asked in a whisper.
No clue,
Eric said with a frustrated look on his face.
Should we pretend something happened?
I chimed in.
To all three of us? Yeah, like maybe your grandma died or Bill got in trouble and we need to help him out. You guys, I beat the boss,
Steven suddenly called out. Holy shit, that was amazing, Steven, I blurted. Yeah, you did it way faster than I'd ever... Eric's words were cut off when Jerry's phone vibrated. Shit, it's Bill, he exclaimed. Bill, your brother? Stephen asked, confused. I could only watch the situation unfold. Sure, Stephen was a dimwit, but even he must have heard about Bill's reputation. Shit, guys, he said he's on his way. There's some trouble with his friend, so he had to leave early. He's gonna be here in like 20 minutes. Then we've got to go now, Eric said in surprise. Guys. I started trying to defuse the situation, but of course it was already too late. Go where? Stephen asked, staring at Eric with wide, expectant eyes. Only now did the two of them realize what they'd done. I frowned and cursed myself. Bill's in trouble. He needs me to bring him... Jerry's voice trailed off for a moment, and he rummaged through his backpack before he pulled out a small tool set. I was supposed to bring it to him, but forgot. He needs it for his job, so I better get going before... Hey, that's alright. We should all go. It's the middle of the night, so it might be dangerous, Stephen said right away. Don't worry, Mom won't notice a thing. Nah, you stay here and play the game. You're doing so great. Rick and I can go, and we'll be back in... Eric started, but Stephen cut him off. No way! You guys are my best friends! If there's trouble, I can't let you go alone. As I listened, the frown on my face only deepened. This was going to be harder than expected. There was more back and forth, but it was clear Stephen wouldn't take no for an answer. He'd already put on his shoes, vehemently insisting on coming along. You can't come, alright? Jerry finally snapped at him. When Stephen heard this, he froze, and I watched his eyes grow wide before he understood what was going on here. I knew it. You guys just don't want me to come along. Shit, now we done it. No, Stephen, I rambled. That's not it. It's just, there might be trouble. It might be dangerous, and we don't want you to... Why don't you guys ever let me come along? No, that's not... Damn it. If you don't let me come, I'm going to tell my mom that you were just here so you could meet up with Bill in the middle of the night. There it was. The worst case scenario. Oh yeah? We'll tell her you made coffee in the middle of the night, Eric retorted, staring at him triumphantly. For a moment, everyone was quiet. Then Jerry and I groaned at Eric's ridiculous threat. She doesn't even care. But if she tells your parents, you guys are going to be in trouble, won't you? Shit, Jerry cursed. Finally, I'd had enough. Whatever, you can come, I said. Both Eric and Jerry turned to me. Rick! They both yelled in unison. My bro's gonna be so mad if we take him along, Jerry confronted me. Yeah, and what if he wants part of the treasure? Eric added. Treasure? Stephen exclaimed, ignoring everything else. I just stared at Eric, throwing up my hands in frustration. A couple minutes later, we were on our way. As we snuck through the village, Stephen in tow, I finally told him where we were going. His eyes grew wide and his jaw dropped when he heard we were going to break into no other place than the Jensen boarding house. But isn't that place haunted? Andy said there are ghosts in the basement, and old Hubert is feeding them kids, and he's... Only babies are scared of old Hubert, Eric whispered back at him. Nah, Andy told me old Hubert once chased him down the road, screaming and cursing at him the entire time. And guess what? A week later, he broke his leg. Didn't he break his leg when he fell with his bike? Jerry asked in a half-bored voice. Yeah, but he said it's because old Hubert cursed him. Just shut up, Stephen. There's nothing scary about that stupid old man, Eric retorted. Stephen opened his mouth to say something back, but Eric flipped him against the ear, motioning for him to keep his mouth shut. As we continued down the road, I couldn't help but look back. The town seemed so different at night, almost as if we'd been transported to a different world. Everything was quiet, and the only sound was that of the wind rustling through the leaves of the trees. Shadows were lurking behind every corner, as if lying in wait for us. All the stories, all the rumors, and all the tales about the old boarding house came back to me. And for the first time in years, I wondered if they might actually be true. Suddenly, I heard something ahead of us and froze. Guys, quiet, I whispered and motioned for them to stop. We all ducked down, trying our best to hide behind a few measly bushes at the side of the road, and watched the area ahead of us with wide eyes. We could already see the old boarding house. It was just down the road, only a few 100 meters ahead of us. I was antsy, scared, and my breathing sped up, expecting Deputy Sheffield to burst out from the nearby underbrush. Stephen next to me was mumbling about old Hubert coming to steal him away. Eric and Jerry had both fallen quiet as well, their eyes darting around wildly, each expecting their own version of some nightly terror coming for them. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds finally stopped. When no one was seen, we continued on.
Probably a cat,
I whispered. The others nodded, but Stephen wasn't convinced. He followed me closely, constantly watching the dark street, visibly afraid. A few minutes later, we reached old Hubert's farmhouse. As always, the meadow next to it was populated by his herd of cattle. Yet all the windows were dark, and when we scanned his bench, we saw no one outside. It seemed the old man was asleep after all. As much as I'd wanted to trust Bill's words, I somehow expected him to sit out here even now, in the middle of the night, watching the old boarding house and waiting for us to show up. Finally, we dashed across the street toward a bunch of trees at the edge of the yard, before we tiptoed onward, pushing ourselves as close to the building's wall as possible, so the moon's light wouldn't reveal us.
Yo, what the fuck are you doing, little bro?
My steps came to a halt, and I was frozen in shock. For a moment, my eyes darted around before I saw a dark figure standing nonchalantly in the center of the yard. It was Bill. The only light was that of a glowing cigarette between his lips, but it was enough to shed light on his face, and his wide grin as he watched us coming closer.
Bill!
Jerry exclaimed. Instantly, he seemed to have forgotten any sort of danger, and rushed toward his brother.
So why'd you call me over to this old shithole? Really think there's any money in there?
Well, I don't know about money, but everyone's talking about treasure, so... In an instant, and before Jerry could react, Bill's hand shot forward and closed around his brother's wrist.
Alright, little bro. What the actual fuck? You called me all the way out here and you don't even know what's in there? You know I'm only here because I need some fucking money, right?
With that, he took the half-smoked cigarette from his mouth and flipped it against his brother. In shock and surprise, Jerry quickly brushed it off himself before he spoke again.
No, trust me, Bill. Everyone's talking about it. It's gotta be true, please. Who's everyone? Those three little shits over there?
No, everyone. Mark Higgins, John Meyer, and you know Robbie, right? He found all that information in that book, and... Before Jerry could continue, Bill yanked his brother in closer.
You fucking shitting me, little bro? Who the fuck cares about those guys? You seriously telling me all this because of some stupid book? You want me to beat the shit out of you?
With that, he began twisting Jerry's arm, who gave a surprised, pained yelp.
No, Bill, please, I swear it's true.
Suddenly, Bill started to laugh and let go of Jerry.
Just kidding, little bro, just kidding, he said, patting him on the shoulder.
Instantly, Jerry began to laugh as well. I watched as the bizarre interaction continued. While Bill was laughing, his face stayed hard and emotionless. Jerry, however, seemed truly happy, staring up at his brother with unbridled awe. Yet I'd seen it, that short moment of fear, and I'd heard that pained yelp. No, this was not a good relationship. Not how Jerry had always portrayed it. Not at all.
So, who's that?
Bill asked, pointing at Stephen, who huddled behind me.
You told me those two shits Reed and Anderson were tagging along, he continued. Who's the third one?
Oh, that's Stephen, Jerry quickly explained.
All right, Stephen,
Bill started as he walked toward us. I stumbled out of his way, but Stephen was frozen, and all the color had drained from his face. Bill might have been a teenager, but he was still much, much taller than Stephen, a towering, dark figure standing in front of a little boy. Then Bill reached out with his hand, took Stephen's chin between his fingers, and put his face in front of the little boy's.
Let me make one thing clear to you, okay? You do exactly what I tell you. If you don't, I'm gonna fucking murder you.
Stephen's face twitched, contorted, but in his fear, he seemed to have forgotten how to speak. When Bill snapped his fingers in front of him, however, Stephen began nodding frantically.
Guess you're not as dumb as you look.
Then he lit another cigarette and made his way around to the old boarding house's main entrance. Stephen had slumped to the ground, and I could see the tears in his eyes. Yet, I didn't care about him anymore. My excitement drove me to where Bill and Jerry stood. This was it. This was what we'd been waiting for so long.
So that's it, right? This piece of shit door?
Yeah, Jerry said, nodding. "It's locked. We got no clue how to open it."
"Oh, come on, little bro. I know Reeds and Anderson are fucking idiots, but why the hell didn't you just break a goddamn window?"
"Because old Hubert will notice," Eric answered.
"Did I talk to you?"
Bill asked, stepping up to Eric, and I could see how he raised one of his hands in an onset of anger. Just in time, Jerry spoke up again, and diffused the situation.
"Bill, he's right. We can't. Old Hubert's gonna call Deputy Sheffield if we try." "Sheffield? Jeez, what kind of shit did you guys do? Fucking hell."
His voice trailed off, but I could hear him curse to himself. Most likely about Deputy Sheffield. I could tell from the way he'd spat his name that the two of them had a history.
"Alright, whatever. No windows. Now let's see."
With that, Bill pushed himself against the door. Did it so hard I heard him grunt. When it didn't so much as budge, I heard him curse again.
"No helping it,"
he said, and kneeled down to study the lock with a lighter.
"Thing's old as shit. Shouldn't take more than a few seconds."
With that, Bill rummaged through his backpack before he took out a set of small, delicate tools. He called Jerry over, told him to get out his flashlight, and to focus the beam on the lock. Then Bill picked up two of the tools and began to tinker with it. At first, Eric and I, and even Steven, who'd slowly inched in closer, didn't know what he was doing. Then it dawned on me. Bill was trying to pick the lock. In an instant, I rushed forward and pushed myself next to Jerry to see what he was doing.
"A word about this to anyone, and you're dead, Reeds. The same applies to the rest of you little shits as well."
I nodded and resumed watching. I didn't know a thing about lockpicking, but it seemed Bill didn't know much about it either. Or he was too drunk or high, or probably both. His hands were shaky and sweaty, and a few times the tool slipped from them as he worked frantically. Whenever it happened, a surge of profanities followed, and he'd yell at Jerry to stop moving the damn flashlight so much. Jerry hadn't moved it at all, but he still apologized to his brother. It took Bill 2 more cigarettes, lots of profanities, and over 10 minutes before the lock finally clicked open.
"Fucking hell. Didn't think that damn lock was in such good condition. Piece of fucking shit."
It was clear Bill was embarrassed about the entire ordeal, but it was also clear he'd never admit it.
"Maybe old Hubert installed a new lock," Jerry suggested. "Shut the fuck up, little bro."
Then he pushed open the door and stepped inside. For a moment, none of us moved. That same sense of fear and respect we felt for the place during our entire childhood was back. Then an almost euphoric feeling washed over me. This was it. Finally, we'd uncovered the many mysterious secrets contained within the Jensen boarding house.
"The fuck are you waiting for? Let's go. I don't have to make you."
Bill snapped at us. In an instant, the euphoric feeling was pushed aside. Pushed aside by one of similar fear, yet with none of the respect the boarding house demanded. The first room we entered was a small, unimpressive lobby. Only an old coat rack and stained yellow walls greeted us. Here and there, the wallpaper was torn apart and dangled from the walls in half-rotten strips. Above us, a lamp dangled from the ceiling. It was asking to be a chandelier, but much too cheaply made to warrant the name. To our right, an old wooden stairway led to the second floor, but Bill ignored it and stepped up to one of the 2 doors that led deeper into the boarding house. Once more, apprehension washed over me, as I thought about the many ghastly tales and rumors I'd heard, but it was soon replaced by a burning curiosity. Eric and Jerry were right behind me, but Steven didn't move a muscle. He stood alone in the small lobby, his body shaking, his lips quivering.
"I'm scared, you guys. I want to go home,"
he mumbled, more to himself than to any of us. Still, he'd said it loud enough for Bill to hear, whose head jerked around, giving the little boy an angry glance. It was enough to shut Steven up instantly. For a few more seconds, he shuffled around awkwardly, before his fear of Bill won over that of whatever might lurk in the darkness ahead. As he followed us, he almost pressed himself against Eric and me. The door Bill had opened led into a large, still fully furnished room. As Jerry illuminated it with his flashlight, we were greeted by a stained floor and bleached carpets. 2 huge couches stood next to an old fireplace, and a handful of tables, their tops scratched and used up, were placed haphazardly in the room's center. The room's right side was entirely filled by a massive wooden counter. I realized where we were. The old drinking hall my grandpa had told me so much about. Further in the back, between two of the old boarding house's windows, stood a gigantic cabinet, flanked by two smaller cupboards. Bill ignored anything else and stepped up to a cupboard and began rummaging through its drawers. He didn't merely search through them, though. Instead, he tore through their contents in a wild, restless fashion, throwing them to the floor in an almost manic way. Eric and I scanned the things he discarded. All we saw, however, were old tablecloths, a bunch of letters, and yellowed, barely readable newspaper articles. I picked one of them up, using my flashlight, and tried to make out what they were about. Only a few select words were still legible, but those were enough, and hinted at what the article was about. Missing people. I reached out for another one when Eric got a hold of me.
"Let's have a look at the cabinet,"
Eric whispered and pulled me after him. Bill had already opened one of its doors, and was busy checking out old pieces of ceramic and glass before he stumbled upon a few bottles of alcohol. When he saw they were empty, he cursed, and hurled one of them across the room where it shattered on the floor. I winced in shock at the loud, thundering sound that seemed to shake the entire room, growing louder and seemingly never-ending before it eventually stopped. Yet, for a moment, I thought I heard something else. The sound of something scurrying away. Rats, I told myself, remembering my grandpa's words.
"There's always rats in old buildings. Always."
While Eric went through the shelves next to Bill, my eyes darted around the room, illuminating its corners and trying desperately to find the rats I'd just heard. All I saw, however, was Stephen, who stood at the other end of the room, unmoving, watching the events with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity.
"Holy shit, dude, look at this!"
Eric suddenly called out and elbowed me. He held up a bunch of old banknotes, wearing a wide grin on his face. Instantly, all of my nervousness and all my worries were blown away. "How much do you think those are worth?" I asked, and took one of them to have a closer look. The moment Bill saw it, he ripped it from my hand and did the same to the ones Eric was holding. All we could do was watch as he stuffed them into his backpack. "Hey, that's our stuff! We found it!" Eric complained and reached out for Bill's backpack. Before he could so much as touch it, Bill got a hold of his hand, pulled him toward himself, and twisted Eric's arm behind his back.
"What the fuck did you just say to me, you little shit? Now listen, Anderson. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't even be in here. Let me make one thing clear to you. If you ever complain again, you ever touch my shit again, I'll break that fucking arm of yours, you understand?"
When Eric didn't speak up, Bill gave his arm another twist, which resulted in a pained, high-pitched shriek from Eric.
Yeah, I get it. "See, Anderson? That wasn't so hard,"
Bill said with a wide grin before he pushed Eric to the floor. Then, almost as if nothing had happened, he went back to the cabinet to continue his search. I walked over to Eric, who was still on the floor, rubbing his arm, and staring at Bill with nothing but pure hatred. "Hey, you alright?" Jerry asked in a low voice, and was about to walk over to him. Eric's head jerked in his direction, giving him a similar stare, and making Jerry stop in his tracks. Then he pushed himself to his feet and turned to me.
"Rick, let's have a look over by the counter."
With that, he led me away from Bill and Jerry. He haphazardly looked through the counter's contents before he spoke up again.
"See, that's why I didn't want him around. Everyone knows that guy's a freaking psycho. Well, everyone but Jerry."
I looked over at them and watched as Bill handed Jerry a few pieces of silverware, which he trustily put into his brother's backpack.
"Well, without him, we'd never—" "I don't care. It doesn't matter anymore. He's gonna take everything anyway. And Jerry's helping him. Fuck him too."
I saw him blink a few times, but when the tears still came to his eyes, he turned away from me in embarrassment. I knew how he felt. This was supposed to be our adventure. Our trip to uncover the truth about the boarding house. Our search for treasure. And now it was all just Bill. It wasn't fair.
"Shit,"
we heard Bill curse.
"Nothing here's worth shit."
In his anger, he threw another piece of ceramic to the floor, before he stomped on to the next room. A second later, he snapped at us to get a move on. This next room comprised a large kitchen, but apart from a few old rusty pots and pans, it was almost completely empty. Another door led to a rundown bathroom, which Bill threw shut a moment later. Back in the lobby, Bill pushed open the door he'd ignored before. It opened to a long, dark hallway that seemed to lead to the lower end of the boarding house. Bill stepped through, undeterred, but I stopped in my tracks. My skin started to crawl as I stared at the looming darkness ahead of us. A darkness that looked like a gaping maw, ready to swallow us up. Bill's flashlight darted around, and I could see dozens of doors that led to a variety of rooms. Yet even Bill's flashlight seemed unable to penetrate the darkness, and the end of the hallway remained out of sight.
"Come on, Rick, let's go."
Eric, who trailed after Bill, called out to me. Yet the moment I set foot into the dark, looming hallway, I couldn't help but feel watched. Once more I stopped, and felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I jerked around, expecting to see old Hubert standing right behind me. Or even worse, Deputy Sheffield. No one was there. The feeling, however, didn't leave me. It persisted like an almost feasible sensation. A cold shudder ran down my spine, and I hurried after Eric.
"Hey, do you feel—" "Anderson, Reed, get a fucking move on!"
Bill snapped back at us. A second later, he'd crossed the distance between us, got a hold of my arm, and pushed me into the first of the many rooms. It was a storage room filled with a multitude of boxes. Jerry and Stephen were already busy going through them.
"Make yourself useful, Reeds,"
he threatened me, already raising his fist to beat me into submission. I gave him a quick nod, hurried over to a box, and began rummaging through it. Stephen, who was next to me, suddenly stopped and looked up. He'd been afraid ever since we'd entered the old boarding house. Afraid of what we'd find. Afraid of Bill. But now, he seemed terrified.
"Did you guys hear that?"
he asked, his voice nothing but a quivering whisper while his eyes darted around. I stopped in my tracks and stared out at the hallway. Even Eric and Jerry had stopped. Yet all we heard was Bill tearing through box after box, kicking them across the room once he was done with them. When he noticed we'd stopped, and especially why, he stepped up to Stephen and slapped him across the back of the head.
"Yo, cut that shit out and keep searching, you little punk."
Stephen cringed in pain and began rubbing his head. Then, with tears streaming down his face, he continued searching.
"I really did,"
he mumbled, but Bill cut him right off.
"Was that? You want another one?"
Stephen was quiet instantly, his small body growing even smaller.
"Thought so,"
Bill said, laughing, and focused on the boxes again. I watched the little boy for a moment. His shoulders were slouched, his nose was running, and fear distorted his face. He was sobbing to himself, and every once in a while I heard him mumble about wanting to go home. At that moment, I felt for him. I really did, especially since it was our fault that he was here. My fault. Then I noticed Bill staring at me, and I quickly continued searching. In the end, we found nothing of worth. The boxes seemed to contain nothing but old books, and stacks upon stacks of moldy clothes. At one point, I saw Bill pocketing an old watch, but by now my resistance was broken, and even my frustration was gone, and all that was left was indifference. The next couple of rooms were all the same. All were filled with things that must have been necessary to run the boarding house's drinking hall. We found boxes filled with various tableware, an old laundry room, and even an entire room filled with chipped chairs and benches. The only interesting discovery was the room that held the equipment that must have once been used in the movie screenings. We saw film reels, a stack of empty frames, and even an old movie poster. In a corner, we even saw an old projector. Before we could even have a look at it, Bill kicked it over, guffawing in delight at the destruction he was causing. All the while, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Whenever I stopped and illuminated the hallway, however, I saw nothing. Even when I strained my ears and listened, all was quiet. I couldn't even hear the rats anymore. I told myself it had to be Stephen's mumblings and his constant sobs that made me so anxious. Yet, I wasn't the only one who was antsy. Eric, too, seemed to have noticed something was wrong, and was constantly checking the hallway. For a moment, the two of us shared a confused look before he inched closer toward me.
"Dude, did you hear that?"
he asked in a hushed whisper, careful not to be overheard by Bill. I was about to shake my head, but then I stopped. Under the sound of Jerry, Stephen, and Bill rummaging through boxes, I heard something else. It was the quiet sound of scratching, as if something was moving nearby. behind the wallpaper and plaster. I strained my ears, trying to make out where it was coming from, but before I could, it was gone again. "Probably rats," I said, staring at Eric. "My grandpa said there are always rats in old buildings. Once he was even jumped by one." Eric nodded, but didn't seem convinced. I wasn't either, and remembered the rest of Grandpa's tale, and what Big George had said. The things behind the walls. Slowly, ever so slowly, the fear the old place had so instilled in me returned, and with it all the tales and rumors. Stories of corpses entombed here, skeletons and ghosts, or worse, things that might lie in wait for us. I was torn from my thoughts by yet another of Bill's outrages. "There's nothing fucking here. You told me about treasure and money, little bro, and so far, all we found is worthless shit." With that, he threw an old blanket at Jerry, who cringed back. "This your idea of a joke?" he asked, stepping up to him. "Get me to come all the way out here on this stupid little adventure of yours, just to—" "No, Bill, I promise there's something here. There's gotta be. Maybe all the good stuff's upstairs. I swear, I'd never try to trick you." "There better be." He spat at his brother before he left the room. In his anger, he thrust his elbow into my ribs to push me aside. For a moment, he was about to head back to the lobby, but then he turned toward the other end of the hallway. This time, we could all make out the sturdy metal door at its end. Bill approached it, but when he tried the handle, nothing happened. After a few moments of grunting and cursing, however, it opened. Instead of another room, all we saw was a set of damp stones that led down to what I assumed to be the basement. Almost instantly, the entire hallway was filled with damp, moldy air. "So, who wants to take a look?" Bill asked, his face contorted into a big, cruel grin. None of us moved. Fear washed over me in heavy waves when I imagined having to go down there, and thought of the many ghastly things that supposedly lay hidden in the old boarding house's basement. One by one, Bill's eyes wandered over us, scrutinizing us before his grin grew even wider and he set out for us. I cringed back to flee from him, but he didn't come for me. Instead, he got a hold of Stephen's arm and began dragging him toward the stairs. "Now, Stephen, how about you make yourself useful and have a look at what's down there?" The little boy's eyes grew wide, and a gasp escaped his mouth. He began crying, and I watched as his entire body shook like a leaf. "No, no, no, no," I heard Stephen, his voice growing louder and more panicked as he got closer to the stairs. All the while, Bill laughed maniacally. "Come on, Stephen, just a little look," he teased him. As he did, Stephen began to squirm under his grip, tried to get away, and I watched as his feet shuffled frantically over the tiled floor in his futile attempt to get away. Then we all heard it. From down below, strange, barely audible slithering sounds reached us. It sounded almost as if something were approaching the stairs. Something wet and snake-like. Stephen froze. His eyes were so wide I was sure they would pop from their sockets any moment now. And then I watched as a wet spot formed on his pants. When Bill noticed it, his laughter only grew in intensity, but he finally let go of the small boy. Stephen stumbled a few steps before he collapsed against the wall, a sobbing, terrified mess. I went over to him, telling him it was all right, and nothing was going to happen to him. But I wasn't sure my words even reached him. For a moment, Bill stared at me, most likely deliberating to make me the next one he'd force down there. Then, as he listened to the strange sounds, even he seemed unsure about what was down there. But then his grin returned. "Jesus Christ, it was a joke. There's probably nothing down there anyway. Well, nothing but rodents or whatever else making those sounds," he added, trying to sound ominous, most likely trying to scare us further. Finally, he threw the heavy door shut. The resulting thud reverberated through the entire hallway, then the old boarding house itself, and seemed to shake it to its very core. Still sitting next to Stephen, I cringed, my eyes darting around in terror, expecting for something, anything to happen. I waited for someone to come for us, or for the basement door to burst back open, and for some lurking horror to drag us all down into whatever moldy hell lay below. Once the sound had ended, however, nothing but deafening silence remained. Then Bill's laughter cut through the air. Laughter at our reactions and the fear on our faces. "The
fuck's wrong with you all? Don't tell me you believe all those stupid stories,"
he asked, shaking his head. He lit another cigarette and started on his way back to the lobby. By this point, I had had enough of this entire damn adventure. First of all, Bill, then the old building and its strange sounds. But most of all, that feeling that we weren't alone here, that we were being watched. Even here in the lobby, I felt it all around me, as if hidden eyes were trying to pry me open. Something was here, I was sure of it, but I couldn't see anything. For a moment, I heard a sound again. A sound coming from the wall right next to me. Once more, Grandpa's story and the words of Big George returned to me.
"Them things in the walls. Them people behind the walls."
I couldn't help but shiver. What if all those stories about strange rituals were true? What if people really had been entombed in these walls, sealed away, but were somehow still alive? Were watching us and perpetually digging their way out to come for us? I started shaking and began feeling sweaty as the fear overwhelmed me. Then I took a deep breath and told myself once more it's just rats. But this time, it didn't work. Not completely. Eric next to me seemed as anxious as I was.
"Dude,"
he whispered,
"you sure it's just rats? It sounds way weird."
I didn't answer. By now, Bill had already taken the first few steps that led toward the second door, completely ignoring the sounds as if he wasn't even hearing them. Then Jerry spoke up. He too had noticed something was wrong, and he seemed as scared as we were, or even more so for speaking up to his brother.
"Hey, Bill, maybe we should get out of here. I mean, there's probably nothing upstairs anyways. And those sounds are... I want to go home,"
Stephen cried from behind me. Bill didn't even bother with Eric, Stephen, or me. Instead, his eyes came to rest on his brother, and I watched as his face grew red with anger. No, red with rage.
"All right, little bro. Are you seriously telling me you want to pussy out?" "No, Bill, but there's something wrong with this place. Don't you hear?"
Jerry's protest was cut short when Bill slapped him across the face so hard he was thrown to the ground. Before he could so much as apologize, Bill got a hold of him and pulled him back up.
"I don't fucking care about those sounds. You know what? I don't give a shit if you're scared. I don't give a shit about what you want. You're not leaving until we find something good. And you better pray we do. Got that?" "But, Bill, get a fucking move on or I swear I'll make you."
He snapped at his brother, before he revealed a switchblade he'd hidden in one of his pockets. All our eyes grew wide, but most of all Jerry's, who began nodding vehemently, and didn't even dare to protest when his brother pushed him up the stairs. A second later, his head jerked in our direction.
"The rest of you, get a fucking move on."
His eyes came to rest on Eric, Stephen, and me. Instantly, Eric and I got a move on, scared of what he'd do with that knife, because we could tell he was serious. More than serious.
"I'm not going,"
Stephen mumbled to himself as he sat down on the floor, knees pulled up to his face and rocking back and forth. For a moment, Bill's cold, hard eyes came to rest on him, and I could already see him walking up to the little boy, threatening to cut him up or even worse. But then he spat on the ground and turned around.
"Whatever,"
he said as he started up the stairs, pushing me and Eric aside in his anger. By this point, I wanted nothing more than to get out. But while I was mad at Jerry, it felt wrong to leave him here all by himself. Sure, he'd gotten us into this mess, but he was still our friend. Even worse, while Bill might have ignored Stephen, I somehow knew he'd not hesitate to come after me and Eric. If not now, if not tonight, then later.
"Stephen, just wait here, all right?"
I whispered to the little boy.
"We're just gonna have a quick look upstairs, then we can all go home."
I got no answer. All I heard were the little boy's sobs. Then I set out after Eric and the rest. With each step I took, I grew more apprehensive. The old wooden stairs creaked under me, the sound stretching on, spreading through the old boarding house endlessly. As they did, I clung onto the wooden railing, afraid the stairs would give way, and whatever lay below would swallow me up. Upstairs, I heard Bill snapping commands at Jerry. Under his words, however, I heard the sounds again. The sounds of scratching and grinding from inside the walls. At times it was distant. At others, it was so close it seemed to come from right beside me, as if something was waiting for us right below the wallpaper. Eric cringed back, letting go of the railing, and moved as far away from the source as he could. Yet neither of us said a word. We were both too afraid to acknowledge whatever was responsible for these sounds, and that if we did, it could reach out and devour us. Instead, we rushed on and finally made it upstairs. What awaited us was another long hallway. It was like the one on the ground floor, and it too continued to the furthest end of the building. As I illuminated it with my flashlight, its walls looked strangely warped, and here and there I thought I saw bumps or protrusions on them, yet they were too distant for the beam of a flashlight to reach. It seemed almost as if the light was swallowed up by a solid mass of darkness. For a moment I just stood there, frozen until Eric poked me. I jerked up and almost backed away, but then noticed him pointing to a door on our left. Eric quickly went inside, but for a while longer I just stood there, staring at the darkness, trying to penetrate it with the flashlight's beam. When I thought I saw something move, I hurried after my friends. "There's nothing there," I told myself. "There's nothing there."
"Well, isn't that something?"
Bill said when he saw me entering the small anteroom.
"I was sure you'd run off, Reeds."
On the other side of the room, Jerry was busy going through an old cabinet, which seemed to be the room's sole piece of furnishing.
"Let's get going,"
Bill snapped at his brother, pushing him onward. The next room we entered turned out to be another kitchen. Without all the dust and the chaos of broken cutlery, it might have once been a fancy place. Bill began rummaging through the various cabinets, but seemed frustrated, throwing dishes and cups to the ground in his desperate, half-mad search for something of value. I watched him for a while, but then I saw Eric approaching a glass door to our left. As quietly as we could, we made our way over there and pushed it open. We found ourselves in an ornate, well-furnished living room. The furniture was old and covered in dust, but must have once been costly and was well crafted. Eric rushed over to a drawer and began searching through its contents. I was about to follow him when I noticed a row of portraits on the wall to our right. The colors had faded because of age, making them look almost black and white. Yet I could instantly tell something was wrong with them. With the beam of my flashlight pointed at them, I took a step closer. They had to be portraits of the Jensen family, but the people in them looked wrong. Their eyes were wide open, angry, hungry, almost as if they were staring right at me. Once more, I felt strangely watched, like I could do nothing but remain frozen under those scrutinizing stares. Why would anyone paint portraits like this? I opened my mouth to call out to Eric, but right at that moment, I could have sworn one of them blinked. In sheer and utter shock, I screamed. The flashlight clattered from my hand and I bumped right into Eric.
"Dude, what the hell are you doing?"
I opened my mouth to tell him about the portraits, but then I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Outside, in the kitchen, Bill and Jerry had opened another door. Neither of them was moving a muscle. They just stood there, frozen in front of the doorframe. Then a strange, musty air reached me, but one that was disgustingly sweet. I watched as Bill's eyes grew wide, saw his jaw drop.
"What the absolute fuck?"
he whispered in a voice much too quiet for him. Jerry next to him was white as a sheet. All the color had drained from his face. His eyes and mouth were open, but no sound escaped him. For a moment, everything was quiet. No one said a word. And by now, Eric had joined me, staring at the two of them, similarly not understanding what was going on. Then Jerry's flashlight slipped from his hands, and the most blood-curdling, terrified scream I'd ever heard escaped from his mouth. Then the sounds reached my ear. This time, they were different. Gone were the scratching and grinding from behind the plaster. Now it was nothing but slithering. The sound of something alive moving. Of wet bodies rubbing against each other, accompanied by some sort of unnatural gurgling.
"What the fuck?"
Bill screamed when he finally found his voice again. His mouth was open as he stumbled backward, his face a mask of purest terror. Then, in the blink of an eye, I saw something move. To this day, I don't know what I saw. It was a long, disgustingly whitish gray thing that stretched out from the room, reaching out for Bill and Jerry. At that moment, panic got a hold of me, and I ran. The things behind the walls, the people behind them, they dug themselves free and were coming for us. As I pushed myself past Bill and Jerry, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Saw something inside that room. It was nothing but shadows dancing in the beam of Jerry's dropped flashlight, but I could have sworn the room was alive, filled with nothing but twisted, elongated shadows. And then Jerry screamed again. In my panic, I took a glance over my shoulder and saw it. I saw how Bill turned away, saw him pull back his hand, and saw Jerry stumble forward. In my terror, I didn't understand what had happened, but I later realized what Bill must have done. Then I was on the stairs, and right at that moment, the sounds around me started anew, grinding and scratching all around us, as if the walls themselves were alive, moving and breathing. In my mind, I could already see the wallpaper stretching, the ceiling growing lower and lower, suffocating me, as if the entire old boarding house was alive and ready to swallow me up. Then I made it back to the lobby. "Stephen," I called out. "Stephen, get out of here!" But when I looked around, the little boy was nowhere to be seen. My eyes darted around, going from corner to corner, but a second later someone crashed into me. I screamed and stumbled back, only to find myself face to face with old Hubert. His face was dark and hard, nothing but a stoic mask. I cringed, afraid he'd attack me, murder me, and add my body to those hidden inside the walls. I tried to rush away, to flee from him, but before I could, he got a hold of my arm. We thought of him as nothing but an old man by now, but his grip was as hard as steel, unrelenting as he pulled me back toward himself. At that moment, I saw something else. Down in that ghastly, dark hallway, something was moving, but I couldn't make it out. Then I heard the creaking of the old metal door, heard it scratch over stone before it fell shut again. "Stephen, are you—" I started, but the old man cut me off. "Out, both of you!" he screamed at me and Eric, who came tumbling down the stairs a second later, pushing us toward the entrance door. We'd barely made it outside when Bill stumbled from the building. He looked as if he'd seen death itself. His entire body was shaking, and he rushed right past us. Then he was gone for good. Eric and I just stood there. We thought about Stephen, about Jerry. I took a single, awkward step forward, but my overwhelming fear drove me right back. I couldn't. I just couldn't. Then old Hubert was back, standing in the small lobby, holding an unconscious Jerry in his arms. He was saying something, yelling it while staring deep into the depths of the boarding house. Yet I was too out of it. Couldn't think straight and only caught on to 3 words. "Not for you." When he turned around, we saw the old man's face. It was distorted by anger, unbridled anger, as he clutched onto Jerry's limp body. At that moment, Eric and I ran, just like Bill had done. We didn't go home that night. Instead, we wandered around town, before we retreated to the soccer field, and huddled together on the small playground, waiting for the sun to rise. We were both too afraid to go home, too afraid to do anything. We didn't know what happened to Stephen. I told myself the little boy must have run, must have just gotten out before us. Then I thought about Jerry, his scream, what Bill had done, and finally old Hubert holding him in his arms. Once more I broke into tears. When the sun dawned, Deputy Sheffield found us. He was angry, and he was an asshole, but even he must have noticed the state we were in. He didn't say another word as he shoved us into the back of the police car and unceremoniously delivered us to our front doors. My parents were already waiting for me. They'd long been informed about what had happened that night. What followed was a lot of trouble. Serious trouble. My parents made it clear that this was the end. I was perpetually grounded and banned from all adventures. If I so much as mentioned the Jensen boarding house, I was in for it. Eric and I didn't hear about Jerry for days. After old Hubert had rescued him, he'd called his parents and an ambulance right away. Thankfully, Jerry had only suffered minor injuries. Nothing but a few bruises and scratches. most likely from when his brother had pushed him into the bathroom. His state of mind, however, was a different story. When he woke up, he was out of it, screaming and struggling to get away from anyone and anything. He screamed that something was coming for him, about a bathtub filled with bloated bodies, and many, many other things. He was completely out of it. Once Eric and I told our stories, the police started an investigation. They did a sweep of the old boarding house, but found nothing. The bathroom Bill and Jerry had found was just that, an old, dirty bathroom, overgrown with mold. It was reasoned that what they must have seen was rats or muskrats streaming from the walls. This was all supported by old Hubert, who told them of a massive, prolonged rodent infestation of the old boarding house. The police did their best to find Bill and ask for his side of the story, what it was he'd seen, but also what he'd done to his brother. Yet, for almost an entire week, Bill remained missing, and no one knew where he was or went. When he was found in a rundown shack on the outskirts of town, he wasn't able to answer any of the police questions. He was dead. An overdose. From that day onward, Eric and I were never allowed to hang out with Jerry again. He wasn't the same anymore. He was a traumatized mess that needed constant psychological care. Even worse, his parents accused Eric and me of being responsible for what had happened. Looking back, I can't blame them. That night, they lost not only one, but both of their sons. The most tragic story of that night, however, is Stephen's. The little boy was never found. After they'd searched the old boarding house, they continued on searching the town and even combed the woods. Yet there was no hint of him. Time and time again, they questioned me and Eric, but all we could tell them was that he stayed in the lobby and must have run away long before we did. It was only years later that I remembered what I'd seen and heard. The movement in that dark hallway, and the basement door falling shut. Stephen's mom took what happened that night even worse than Jerry's parents. The woman had always suffered from her own demons, from overwork and her husband's death. Her son had been her everything, and after his disappearance, she suffered even more. Only 3 weeks after our late-night adventure, she disappeared as well. Some say she couldn't take it anymore, and took her own life somewhere deep in the woods where no one would find her body. Others say she eventually went to the Jensen boarding house herself, and suffered a fate similar to whatever Stephen's was. All this sparked a plethora of new rumors amongst the kids and teenagers in town. Rumors of monsters and twisted beings, of giant rats and corpses in the walls, for Jerry's word spread through the town like a wildfire. Even rumors about old Hubert, who'd supposedly murdered not only Stephen, but also his mother, to hide whatever lurked in the depths of the old boarding house. Yet, soon after our visit, we realized no one would ever get the same chance we had again. The Jensen boarding house's doors were secured by heavy locks, its windows boarded up, and protected by heavy metal bars. Even access to its yard was restricted under the pretense of heavy penalty. After that, things changed. Not only for our small town, but also for us. It wasn't me, however, who got the blunt of it. As had happened so many times before, it was Eric who got it the worst. He'd always had a reputation in town, one of being a troublemaker, a bad apple in the making. It was he who'd unofficially been declared the ringleader of our little adventure. It must have been his idea. He must have convinced us or even forced us to go along, and he abandoned Stephen in the lobby. Lots of trouble followed. Lawsuits were filed. Eric became the victim of relentless bullying, and his family was ostracized by our small community. Eventually, they couldn't take it anymore and moved away. For a while, Eric and I stayed in contact, but we both knew things weren't the same anymore, and never would be. It was me who told him about Jerry's death. One day, the nightmares and the trauma became too much for him. After that, we didn't talk anymore. We couldn't. Our feelings of guilt were too strong and our relationship fizzled out. Yet there was one thing I never learned anything about, and only ever heard wild guesses and shoehorned explanations about. What exactly had Jerry and Bill seen that night? Even after years of therapy, and after hearing the same explanations, The same stories about rat infestations and rodents again and again. I just couldn't believe it. Not after what I'd heard in that bathroom. Half hidden by Jerry's blood-curdling scream. I'd heard it. I'd heard what sounded like an assortment of voices. Of giggling, laughing voices. There were also the words of old Hubert. Not for you. Whenever I think about that night, those words reverberate in my mind. Who or what had he been talking to? Was it the Jensen boarding house itself? Had his obsession driven him crazy, and into believing the building itself was alive? Or did something more sinister lurk in its depths? Maybe it was directed at the remains of whatever poor souls had died there. Or maybe he directed it at something else entirely. As the years went by, I never got over what happened at the Jensen boarding house. However much I tried to forget about it, to move on and live a normal life, I couldn't. The old boarding house was still the same looming presence it had always been, and stories and rumors about it were still shared amongst the town. When I became an adult, the next generation of kids seemed as obsessed with the place as my friends and I had been, always telling new stories and always spinning new yarns. Eventually, my guilt and my inner demons drove me onto a certain path, one that gave me a way to do what little I could to make sure nothing like that would ever happen again. I signed up for the force, and became a deputy myself. Even though the old boarding house had been sealed off for years now, and old Hubert kept his self-imposed office as its warden, I still kept the place in check, and deterred any advances the kids in town made. I'm sure I became as much an enigma to them as Deputy Sheffield had been to us back in the day. Yet, there are always those who disregard all warnings, who get obsessed with the old stories, and who can't be stopped by locks or boarded-off windows. The next time someone broke into the Jensen boarding house, it wasn't local kids, but a trio of guys from out of town. Our town is a small and isolated farming community, and what little industry we have is almost entirely related to agriculture. Yet every year during harvest season, we experience a much-needed influx of people. They are seasonal workers, part-timers, but also those down on their luck, temps who can't hold a steady job. Our community is a tightly knit one, and many of the townspeople weren't fond of strangers, and regarded them with a weary eye. Most of those who arrived weren't bad people. Many were good, hard workers who'd come down on hard times. Others, however, were bad news, and there were always some who were bad news. Even now, I remember my mother's warnings to stay clear of the fields during harvest seasons, and especially to stay clear of those people. I guess that's small towns for you. One year, however, a group of truly bad apples arrived. It was a group of 3 from a city up north who wanted to make some money for themselves. They were a rowdy bunch, drunks who walked through town as if they owned the place, who made a big show of themselves, and who made it no secret how much they looked down on us, country bumpkins. They hit the bar every night, harassed the local girls, and got into a lot of arguments. I was called in multiple times to tell them to knock it off, catch some sleep, and stop bothering people. It wasn't anything too serious, but of course things were bound to escalate. One night they got a bit too touchy with a girl, and when a man stepped in, they beat him half to death. It was clear they'd been out for trouble that night, and it was clear they thought they'd get away with a bit of roughhousing. That was the last straw. We took them in and told them they would be out of town by the next day or there'd be serious trouble. We also clarified that we didn't mind bending the law a little in case they overstayed their welcome. Say what you want, but we know how to keep our town safe. We thought that was it, that they'd pack up and leave town. Hell, that's what we told everyone they did. As so often, however, the real story was entirely different. We just couldn't talk about it out in the open. Had to sweep it under the rug, and made sure none of the local kids got wind of what truly happened. I got the call in the early morning hours. It was none other than old Hubert, who'd contacted the station about a break-in at the boarding house. The old man had been woken by noises from the building, and had noticed the beams of flashlights through the slits of the boarded-up windows. When he went to investigate, he saw that whoever was responsible had removed the metal bars from a window, pried it open, and made their way inside. When I heard this, I was serious in an instant, hit up my colleague Deputy Williams, and the two of us went on our way. It was still early in the morning, and the sun hadn't fully risen yet, but I kept my eyes open for any forlorn figures around town. Shit, I cursed when I saw no one. What's up with you, Rick? Why are you so serious? Williams asked me when he noticed my tense expression. Just having a look out in case it was some of the local kids, I answered, my eyes glued to the area ahead of us. Is it because of what happened to you back when you were a kid? That was years ago, man. And what, Craig? I snapped at him. What if another kid vanished tonight? What if others are traumatized like Jerry and end up killing themselves? How can you be so fucking calm? Jesus Christ, Rick, calm down, okay? You think I can just fucking calm down when... Yo, who's that over there? He cut me off, pointing at a figure ahead of us. A man was stumbling down the street, barely able to put one foot in front of another. The moment we got closer, we recognized him as one of the trio who'd caused trouble around town. Wait, didn't we tell him to fuck off? Why's that guy still here? You think the others left him behind? I strained my eyes. Gotta be drunk or high, I said. Then I saw his face, the panic on it, and I knew something else must have happened. And I had a damn good idea what it was. I expected him to run the moment he noticed our police car, most likely afraid we'd come to take things into our own hands. Instead, he rushed toward us. He was crying, begging and rambling on incoherently that something had happened to his friend and was now coming for him. None of his too-good-for-you, aloof attitude remained. He was nothing but a scared mess and seemed completely out of it. I told him to get in the car, but he refused, screaming at us to help his friends, that they were in trouble and we had to come along. When I asked what had happened, all he did was point to the Jensen boarding house, before he repeated his rambling pleas. For a moment, I was unsure what to do, and when I looked at the building, images of our very own break-in returned to me. I was about to open the car door, about to set out for the old boarding house, but Williams had been faster and had already left the car. Get in the car, asshole, now! He screamed at the man, gun in hand. We'll listen to what you have to say. Maybe, but down at the station. The guy was taken aback by Williams' outburst, and for a moment I expected him to dart away. Then he heard the cocking of Williams' gun. No other word was said, but the guy nodded, his resistance all but broken. While Williams still trained the gun on him, I was quick to cuff him and push him into the back of the car. Look, we'll help your friends, but we need to know what happened, I told him. At the station, Williams and I lost no time, and questioned him right away. So why'd you guys break into the place? I asked the guy. We heard rumors down at the bar. People talked about the place, said all sorts of things. Said it was haunted, there's monsters living in the walls, and that's a place of old murders. Didn't believe any of it, but these kids talked about something else. Said the place was full of treasure, money. I groaned when I heard this and cursed to myself. And let me guess, Williams started. You believe that bullshit, and decide to loot the place before we fuck off, right? Well, we got no money, didn't get paid a lot, so we thought... You thought you'd find something good and you could sell it off. Got it. I cut him short. A reluctant nod was all we got for an answer. So, how'd you guys do it? We set out in the early morning, around 3. Thought we'd get in, get some stuff, be out of town before anyone would notice. My friend Johnny used his tools to get rid of the metal bars, pried open the windows, we went inside. It was all dark in there, so we took out our flashlights, started exploring. All we saw was old shit. Dirty curtains, rotten furniture, you know. Weren't so sure about treasure, but it had taken Johnny almost a half an hour to get that window open. So he said we should at least have a look around. When I heard all this, my body tensed up. I leaned forward to not miss a single word. All of this hit way too close to home and sounded way too familiar to my own adventure. It was Wallace. He heard it first. Told us he heard something moving, but saw nothing. No rats, no nothing. Listened more closely while we searched and said it was coming from the walls. Said there was something moving inside of them. Now me and Johnny, we started laughing.
Told him to stop being scared of damn rats. Even hit the walls to scare the beasts off, but Wallace wasn't convinced.
I couldn't help but grimace when I heard that. Those sounds, the same sounds we'd heard back then. We're not asking you about sounds or rats, goddammit, William snapped at the guy. What the fuck did you do next?
Found nothing downstairs, so we headed up. And then Wallace, he went into this one room and told us there were these creepy old paintings. Said they looked real weird, all sorts of wrong. Had enough of this shit by then, told him to stop looking at them. And then he screamed and we rushed over. Told us he had a closer look at one of them. Said it fell down when he touched it and there was something behind it.
Shut the fuck up about that superstitious... William started, but I cut him off. What did he see? I asked, my voice much louder and much more urgent than I'd wanted it to be. Those damn paintings. I remembered them right away. And I remembered thinking the same thing, and how I thought the eyes in one of them had blinked at me.
Said there's a hole behind it. He saw something staring at him from the wall.
William scoffed, but paid him no heed, and motioned for the guy to continue.
Now Johnny and I, we both checked it. Saw a damn rat scurrying away. Laughed our asses off again. Told Wallace to stop being a pussy, but he said it was no rat. Told him enough with the damn jokes, but he had none of it. Started arguing, told us we should get the hell out of there. Was about to turn into a fight when Johnny made fun of him even more. Stepped in, told Wallace we'd have a look in the back, and he should wait for us by the stairs if he was too pussy to come. Said nothing, but when Johnny and I started down the hallway, he didn't follow. We were going through some rooms, nothing but rotten bed sheets in there. We heard a scream. Wallace again. By then we were fed up with his bullshit and screamed at him to shut the fuck up, but got no answer. When we reached the stairs, he was gone.
Let me guess, your little pussy of a friend ran, right? Williams asked, grinning. When he said this, the guy instantly shook his head.
No way. Sure, we argue, we fight, but you don't let your mates down, never. Even if you're scared shitless, you don't run. Wallace knew me and Johnny wouldn't let it go. We knew something must have happened. So we got back to the front and called out for him, but nothing. Went back to the room with the damn paintings to see if he was messing with them again. After a while, Johnny goes to check that other room, that bedroom, and I hear what sounds like a fight.
Once more, I thought back to when I'd been there, but we'd never actually entered a bedroom.
I go in thinking Johnny found Wallace and the two of them got into a fight. And then I see Johnny standing by the bed, and there's this figure in front of him. Thought it was Wallace, but he had his hands around Johnny's neck. I wanted to call out to him to stop, but then pointed the flashlight and it's...
At this moment, the guy's voice trailed off. Then his eyes grew wide. His lips began quivering. And when he spoke again, his voice was much more agitated, and he was stumbling over his words.
It's not Johnny, but something else. It was this figure, this gray thing. Looked like a man, but also not. I was so shocked I dropped the damn flashlight. But I saw it. I saw how it moved, how it dragged Johnny away. That room was too small. It was too small. So it must have dragged him somewhere else. Into the walls, or wherever it came from, and...
Cut the shit. You telling me your friend was dragged away by some sort of ghost? When the man heard this, he got furious, straining against his restraints, screaming at Williams.
I know what I saw. I damn well know what I saw. How would you know? How would you...
But suddenly his anger faded away, and an expression of misery came over his face.
I wanted to help him. To do something, but I was scared. Too fucking scared, and I couldn't think straight. Ran back down, threw myself out the window to get help, but then...
What kind of shit are you on? As Williams continued his angry tirade, I couldn't help but shiver. This story, things in the walls, I tried to find a logical explanation, anything. I told myself Williams was right, and the guy was most likely on drugs. Maybe he and his friends had gotten into a fight. Hell, maybe he'd murdered them and had hallucinated whatever monster he was talking about. Yet as much as I tried to convince myself, it was all humbug. I'd heard too many stories about things in the walls or people behind them. Way too many. Then I stared at the guy in front of me. I saw how sweaty his face was. how much his hands were shaking, and how dilated his pupils were. It was clear he was on something, and it was clear we couldn't trust his story. At least in part. Eventually, we told the guy we'd lock him up until we'd figured out what had happened to his friends. I expected him to protest, to rage and grow angry. But nothing. All he did was beg us to help his friends, and to save them from the things in the walls. "Can't believe this shit," William said, shaking his head as we made our way back to the front. "I'm going to check it out," I said. William shrugged. "Sure, knock yourself out. I'm not going to waste my time with that shit. They probably had a fight and the other two were long gone." A minute later, I was on the phone with old Hubert. I told him that 2 of the men might still be at the old boarding house, that they might be dangerous, and that I wanted to investigate the place. I told him nothing about the monsters in the walls, though. I couldn't risk him calling it bullshit and not letting me into the building. When I arrived a good 10 minutes later, I saw old Hubert had already unlocked the door, and most likely made his way inside without me. "Mr. Hubert?" I called out, but got no answer. I cursed to myself. Why hadn't he waited for me? Even in his old age, he was always adamant about taking care of the old boarding house. If those 2 guys were still around, the old man might very well be in danger. When I found him, he was in the old drinking hall. His face was hard and angry. "Causing such a ruckus here. Made sure I locked up everything good and well, and still..." By now, the sun had been up for a good hour, but all the windows except for one were boarded up, allowing almost no light to enter, and keeping the place in a perpetual state of twilight, even though I could see the destruction those 3 guys had caused. As we made our way through the room, memories washed over me. I saw the old counter and saw the cabinets we'd searched. They'd been knocked over, turned upside down, and one of them had been smashed to pieces. "How dare they?" the old man mumbled, and was about to go forward to one of the still intact cabinets, most likely to put it back in place. I instantly put my hand on his shoulder. "We can fix those later." Yet when I said this, the old man gave me a questioning look, almost as if he didn't understand what I was talking about. Then, after a few seconds, he nodded. "Let's have a look around. The guy said they went upstairs before..." I didn't finish what I was about to say. I couldn't. For a moment, old Hubert stared at me expectantly, but then we made our way to the stairs in silence. When he tried to make his way up there right away, I motioned for him to let me take the lead. "We don't know if those guys are still around. We wouldn't want them to attack you or kick you down the stairs." The old man opened his mouth, most likely to protest, but before he could, I got out my gun and started up the stairs. "Someone there?" I called out, but got no answer. Then I recalled the names the guy had mentioned. "Wallace? Johnny?" Once more, I heard nothing. No movement, and not even the sounds in the walls that had so burned themselves into my memory. No, all I heard was the creaking of the stairs and of old Hubert following me, and my beating heart. When I'd made it to the top, I set out for the living quarters in the old boarding house's front room right away. The moment I stepped into the small kitchen, my steps came to a halt, and I had to take a deep breath. The door to the bathroom was right there. The bathroom in which both Bill and Jerry had seen what eventually broke them. Old Hubert continued on, but I didn't follow him. Instead, taking one step at a time, I approached the door. The closer I got, the more anxious I felt. My hands were sweaty and shaking, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart was pounding in my chest. For a moment, I just stood there in front of the door. Then, after taking a deep breath, I tore it open. My heart skipped a beat, and I cringed back, half expecting to find some sort of twisted monstrosity inside. All I saw, however, was an old, dirty bathroom. The stench was unbearable. The bathtub was half full and overgrown with sick, heavy mold, while the toilet bowl had shattered, and was now nothing but a mold-covered heap of ceramic. Behind it all, I saw a wall of half-crumbled tiles, most likely destroyed by the room's unrestrained mold. Almost in a trance, I stepped forward, ignoring the wet squelching of the mold below my feet, the heavy, disgusting stench, and approached the half-tiled wall. There were holes. Tunnels. Rats, I thought. Everyone had said rats must have flooded the room. and had scared Jerry and Bill. But was that really...
Leave that be,
old Hubert suddenly called out.
Nothing good comes from rummaging through the trash.
He was right. I shook my head and left the disgusting bathroom behind. By now, the old man had already made his way into the living room, and was standing in front of the many portraits. As I sent the beam of the flashlight into the room, I saw it was still the same. I recognized the cabinet Eric had searched, and saw the same old, costly furniture. When I tried to enter the room, however, the old man was quick to step up to me, and push me from the room.
No one's in there. If they're around, they gotta be somewhere else. Don't want them to break more stuff. Or, God behold, cause more trouble in town.
I gave him a nod, and together we approached the kitchen's only other door, the one leading into the bedroom. I was serious in an instant, gun at the ready. I pushed open the door. The room I found was almost entirely barren. All that greeted me was an old bed that filled most of the room, and a giant wardrobe that stood against one of its walls. There was no hint of the two guys anywhere. Nonetheless, I pushed myself past a protesting old Hubert and took out my flashlight. Gotta check if there's hints of a fight, I told him. I saw that the old rotten bedsheets were undisturbed, as was the wardrobe. Then I checked the room's stained carpet to see if there was blood. Yet the guy had talked about a figure in the dark, and that his friend had been dragged away. The bed, I thought. Stepping around it, I searched for scratches or any other signs of a disturbance. Hell, I even checked under the bed. But other than an assortment of dust bunnies, I found nothing. Finally, I stepped up to the walls, and began scanning them for tunnels, entrances, or anywhere they weren't solid. Behind me, old Hubert was shuffling around nervously, restlessly.
Don't know what you're looking for, but they aren't there.
The old man barked at me.
The back. We gotta check the back.
With that, he stepped up to me, got a hold of my arm, and half pulled me from the room. There was a certain ring to his voice, an urgency, almost a bidding. When I'd stepped outside, the old man took one more look into the room before he threw the door closed. Yet for a moment, I thought I heard something from behind me. From behind the closed door. A shiver went down my spine. Suddenly, I felt old Hubert's hand on my shoulder, and I almost cringed.
The back,
he said with the same sense of urgency, with an almost feasible worry. I took a deep breath and finally followed him to check the rest of the second floor. For the next couple of minutes, we checked out all the rooms in the back. It was nothing but storage rooms and about a dozen guest rooms. Except for one, they were entirely undisturbed. In the end, we found no hint of the guy's friends. After we descended the stairs, I considered checking out the basement. But the moment my beam hit the basement door, I found it was still shut. Once we made it outside, old Hubert busied himself with his keys and the multitude of locks he must have installed at the main entrance.
Must have left after all,
he said, turning to me before he closed the last and final lock. Again, there was something in his voice. But this time, it was something I couldn't place. Was he trying to convince me? And yet, I didn't question him. There'd be no use anyway. What else could we do? Go back inside and go through the entire place again? No. Instead, I merely nodded, thanked him for coming, and went back to my police car. Once I'd made it back to the station, Williams looked up.
Well, how'd it go, Rick?
Nothing.
See? Told you so. No clue why you're always so concerned about that damn building.
I opened my mouth to say something, but then I sighed and went to the back. The moment the guy saw me, he jumped off the trunk and rushed to the front of the cell.
What about Johnny and Wallace? You found them, right?
I gave him a shrug. Found nothing. No hint of anyone still being there. Your friends probably...
No,
he started, shaking his head repeatedly.
You gotta go back. I saw it. Johnny was taken and...
We checked the rooms. I cut him off. There are no holes, no hint of a struggle, nothing.
Must have gone back. After it dragged him away, it must have gone back into hiding and...
Stop spouting nonsense, I yelled at the man. Then I took a deep breath. All this was getting to me, and all the fears I pushed away were coming back to me. All because of this damn story. about things dragging people away. But even if I didn't want to admit it, also because of the way old Hubert had acted. In the end, we did little about the guy. Sure, we could have locked him up, charged him with trespassing and property damage, but everyone just wanted him gone. Most of all, the sheriff. And so we simply released him, and told him what we told him before, to be out of town by evening. The guy protested, shouted at us for not caring, for leaving his friends to die, and said that we were in league with whatever lived in that damn building. Eventually, though, his energy left him. He gave up, and soon after left our town behind. The entire story left me with an unpleasant aftertaste. There were too many things that didn't add up. Even worse, somehow, in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but feel like an accomplice. As if I'd helped old Hubert with something. Before long, those feelings drove me to look up more information about those three guys. Yet I didn't find out much about them. Over the years, all three had collected their fair share of misdemeanors and other charges. The trouble they'd caused in town and the break-in at the Jensen boarding house were only the latest in a long row of similar cases. When I checked the name of the guy we'd taken in, I found out that he'd met his end soon after. Gang-related crime, they called it. When I checked on his friends, however, I found nothing. I'd hoped they'd indeed left their friend behind, and had returned to wherever they'd come from. I even contacted the station in the city they'd been from, but I was told the last time they'd been seen or caused any trouble was long before harvest season. For all I knew, they'd indeed vanished. Or they'd been taken by whatever the guy had seen that day. By them things in the walls, as Big George had called them. I wasn't bothered about those guys. They were scum, after all. Yet I couldn't help but wonder about the Jensen boarding house. What exactly was going on in that place? Was there really something other than rats inside those old walls? Were the stories of ghosts and monsters actually true? For weeks, I told myself it was exactly what my grandpa had called it. Nothing but humbug. I was an adult now. Stories about ghosts and murders had no place in my life. I tried to convince myself that all Bill and Jerry had seen were rats, and that Stephen had somehow gotten lost when he fled the old boarding house. Yet deep inside, I always knew that wasn't true. I knew there was something there. Something sinister was hiding inside the Jensen boarding house. No, not just hiding. It was lurking there, waiting for unsuspecting people to enter and take them away. That guy's story had reawakened the same curiosity I'd felt as a kid, and I'd lost so long ago. It was as if a small ember had been smoldering in the back of my mind, and now it had finally burst into flame once again. A flame that burned bigger and hotter than ever before. I had to figure out what was going on at the Jensen boarding house, and what those things in the walls were. I decided I'd get back and investigate the place once more, this time without the company of old Hubert. Once my shift on the day I'd chosen ended, I drove to the nearby soccer field and parked my car right next to it. The local boys stopped their game and eyed me, but when I didn't approach them, they soon went back to it. As I watched them, nostalgia flooded me. I'd spent so many afternoons there. Right there, Jerry, Eric, and I had hatched our plans on how to get into the Jensen boarding house. And now, just like we'd done almost 2 decades ago, I approached the place, keeping my eyes open for old Hubert. I couldn't help but laugh. It felt like I was a boy again, had been transported back in time, and my friends were right behind me. I could almost hear their voices. Eric's desperation about entering the place, and revealing the truth about its many mysteries, and Jerry's hushed whispers about the evils of old Hubert. Yet things truly had changed. I'd expected having to wait until nightfall, or that I would somehow have to trick the old man. But he was nowhere to be seen. It seemed, in old age, his diligence as the building's warden wasn't the same anymore. For a few moments, I let my eyes wander, to see if anyone else was nearby. Once I knew I was alone, old reflexes returned to me. I made my way into the yard unseen, and pushing myself against the building's walls, dashed behind it. Then I checked the boarded up windows, and soon found the one the guys must have used to enter. While the board had been put back in place, the metal bars protecting it were gone, and the glass was still broken. I stopped and scanned the area. I couldn't risk being seen. It would be the talk of the town if a deputy broke into the boarding house, and was sure to start another flood of rumors. Once everything was clear, I swung myself onto the windowsill, and a moment later, I was inside. Even now, in the late afternoon, the place was still held in that same perpetual twilight. With fast steps, I left the ransacked drinking hall behind, and made my way to the lobby. The door to the ground floor's hallway stood wide open, and driven by a strange sense of curiosity, I stepped forward, into its looming darkness. Soon enough, I could hear them again. The same strange sounds of grinding from behind mortar and brick. They were muffled, barely audible, and almost accompanied my steps. Yet they were there, unmistakably so, and I wondered why I hadn't heard them when I was here with old Hubert. It seemed almost as if his presence alone had been enough to quiet them. Once more, I thought back to how he'd acted, and couldn't help but wonder if he was in league with whatever lurked in the old boarding house's depths. A moment later, I turned on the wall to my right and knocked against it. At first, it sounded like any normal wall, but when I listened more closely, I could hear the faintest echo. It sounded like there really was something inside these walls, as if there were tunnels snaking through them. When I knocked once more, the sound started again, this time louder, as if something was reacting to my knocking. I shivered. I had so many questions on my mind, questions without answers. For a moment, I grew angry, raised my hand to knock against the wall again, harder, louder, to break it open, tear it down, and reveal the hidden truth that lay beyond. I opened my mouth to scream and to tell whatever lurked inside to come out. Then I stopped myself. Calm down, you idiot. If you cause a ruckus, it will alert people. Just find out what happened to those guys. If I could prove they'd been dragged away by something, then we could start an investigation and figure out what was going on here. Then my eyes wandered to the sturdy metal door that led to the basement. Instantly, my skin started to crawl. I remembered how Bill had threatened us to go down there, but also what I saw just before I'd fled from the old boarding house. I took a deep breath before I put my hand on the handle. At first, the door didn't budge and seemed to be held in place. Then it creaked. Its edges ground against the doorframe before it finally jumped open. Right away, the same damp, moldy air assaulted me, and I had to cover my mouth. This time, though, I realized it wasn't just mold and stale air. There was something disgustingly sweet about it. A smell of rot or decay. Oh God. What the hell's down here? Some of the old stories crawled back into my mind. Those of blood rituals, cannibalism, and hidden bodies. I was about to pull out my flashlight when I saw something move in the darkness below. I froze. Who's there? Then I thought about Stephen. That shadow. What if something had dragged him down there? Yet, when I illuminated the basement, all I saw was its dark, sodden floor. Suddenly I heard something. It was distorted, barely audible, but it sounded like a strange, guttural voice, as if someone was mumbling to themselves. As I stepped on the first of the many stone stairs, my eyes were glued to the musty floor below, my mind heavy with ideas of what I might find down there. Then it happened. As I stepped on, my foot found nothing but empty air. I almost tumbled forward, but managed to hold on to the old, rusty railing laid into the wall. I cursed in pain as sharp pieces of rust dug deep into my skin. My hand began growing wet with blood, and for a short, terrible second, I thought I'd slide off and fall down the stairs. A moment later, I was back at the top. Yet I could hear them. The same disgusting sounds I'd heard all those years ago. The sounds of something slithering through the darkness below. But I saw nothing. Whatever was down there kept itself hidden. When I focused the flashlight's beam on the stairs, I saw that half of them had crumbled away, leaving behind holes and treacherous slides. I told myself to go down there, to explore the basement and figure out what had happened to Stephen. My hand closed around the railing once more. I moved my foot forward and put it on the first step again. Yet, my other foot didn't want to move. Fear washed over me in heavy waves. Fear of what I might find down there. But also the fear of those stairs crumbling away and trapping me down there forever. No, I couldn't go down there. Not now, not ever. Cursing, I threw the door shut again, and told myself to check the upstairs again. I had to check that bedroom. Not only had the guy's friends vanished in there, but old Hubert had almost pulled me from that room. Only a minute later, I was upstairs, back in the small kitchen, and threw open the door to the bedroom. Everything was still the same. The bed was undisturbed, and the giant wardrobe still stood against the wall like an unmovable monolith. Slowly, ever so slowly, I sent the beam of the flashlight around the room. First over the floor, then the walls, and eventually the ceiling. Yet I saw no holes or openings. Then I stared at the wardrobe again, and the guy's words echoed in my mind. Must have gone back. After it dragged him away, it must have gone back into hiding, and... I checked below the bed. I checked the walls. But I'd never checked the wardrobe. What if the figure they'd seen had been hiding in there? It was the only possible place. What if someone, or something, had hidden in there and jumped them? Maybe their bodies were right there in that wardrobe. Preparing myself for the worst, I put my hand on the handle before I tore it open. At first, all I saw was a row of half-rotten jackets and mantles, moth-eaten and dusty. When I pushed them aside, however, I saw that the wardrobe's back was broken apart. In an instant, I got hold of the clothes, tore them from their hangers, and threw them aside. Almost the entire back of the wardrobe was gone, and nothing but a few splinters of wood remained. Yet it wasn't the splinters my eyes rested on. They were resting on the wall, or rather, the missing wall. For what I saw at the back of the wardrobe was a giant hole. I stared at it with wide eyes, and a cold shudder went down my spine. Dear God. It was actually true, wasn't it? All those tales. All those stories about things in the walls, about people behind them. With shaking hands, I pointed the flashlight at the hole, half expecting, half hoping I was wrong, and that it was nothing but an old wall whose plaster had crumbled away. It wasn't. It was a hole, but not just any hole. It was one that was much too huge to have been made by rats or other rodents. It was so big a person could crawl inside, or someone could be dragged into it. When I stepped in closer, I soon noticed something else. The hole was connected to some sort of tunnel. A tunnel that seemed to continue downwards through the wall. My entire body was shaking by now, and I had to will myself to step forward. When I did, I saw pieces of clothing clinging to the hole's edges. Edges that were caked in something dark and brown. Blood. It had to be blood. It couldn't be anything else. Dear God, that guy had said his friends had been dragged away into the walls, and this here was proof. As crazy as it seemed, the stories were true. Something had to be living inside these walls. Something other than rats. Whatever it was crawling and slithering through them, dragging people away, murdering them, and maybe even eating them. Yet what was it? What exactly was lurking in these walls? There were so many stories, so many rumors. Ghosts, demons, monsters. Then I heard it. The same grinding, no, slithering sounds, telling me something was moving inside this damned wall, this tunnel. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I began shaking and my heart pounded in my chest. This was no rat. It was too loud. I heard ragged breathing that sounded like that of a large animal, or maybe even a human being. Whatever it was exerting itself, pulling itself upward through the wall, ever closer to me. I stumbled back, tore out my gun, and pointed the flashlight at the hole. "Come out, you fucker. Whatever you are, come out," I mumbled. A second later, something barged from the hole. I screamed, pulled the trigger, only to see a big, fat rat. I cursed, kicking it aside, and focused on the hole again. Suddenly, I was 8 years old again, back in that forest, staring down at the supposed foxhole Eric, Leo, and I had discovered. Once more, I found myself face to face with a pair of glowing yellow eyes. Eyes that couldn't be that of a rat. A second later, however, something moved in the dark, and I watched as a grin appeared below the eyes. A grin wider than any I'd ever seen. Wider than should be possible. I watched as that mouth opened, saw misshapen teeth, and a disgusting, long tongue that pushed itself outward. Then the thing came for me, faster than I could have imagined. Two whitish-gray hands shot forward, got a hold of the hole's edges, and the creature began to pull itself outward. For a split second, my brain didn't comprehend what I was seeing. I thought it was a body, a victim of the Jensen family. Then I snapped back to reality, and I realized this thing was very much alive. It was a living, breathing organism, more animal than human. Its hands were too big, had too many fingers. Thick, stumpy fingers. The face was nothing but a crude approximation of a human's. Nothing but a twisted caricature. Its skull was too wide, too flat, while its jaws were gigantic and made up more than half its face. Where its nose should have been was nothing but a wet, open hole. The eyes I'd seen before were now barely visible, half hidden by a heavy, protruding forehead. It was a disgusting abomination, one of pudgy, white skin and entirely hairless. I screamed and cringed back. I watched as another pair of hands shot forward, another pair that seemed to be connected to its body. All the while, the first pair was scratching wildly over the floor as the creature pulled itself toward me. I fired the gun once, twice, heard the thing screech before it slithered away again. Right at that moment, the entire wall began to shake. No, not just the wall, the entire room, the entire freaking building. It felt as if the walls around me had come alive, as if a multitude of things were moving and slithering through them all at once. Panic washed over me. Raw, hot panic. I tried to rush from the bedroom, but ran straight into the half-open door. Dazed, I stumbled through the small kitchen before I crashed right through the glass door that led into the living room. I screamed at myself to get up, screamed at myself to get away. But then my eyes found the same row of paintings again. I saw their eyes again. The same hungry eyes, but only in some pictures. In others, they were missing. Nothing but holes. Empty holes. What eyes there were, though, were staring at me, watching me as I tried to get to my feet. I thought back to when I was a kid, how I thought those paintings were wrong, that they'd been staring at me. But those things, even then, even back then, they'd been watching me. Watching us. Finally, I was up again. But one look toward the bedroom showed me more of the ghastly hands. That thing was coming for me. I rushed out of the kitchen toward the stairs, was on them, but felt something close around my ankle. Time stopped, and I stared down at the disgusting, misshapen hand that had pushed itself through the wallpaper and had gotten a hold of me. Its long fingernails, or rather claws, dug through my clothes, through my skin, and deep into the flesh of my calf. Then time moved again. I felt my body falling forward, and mere moments later I hit the floor of the lobby, landing hard on my right shoulder. Instantly, I lost grip of the gun, and it clattered away. Then I just lay there, unable to move and in terrible pain. By now, the walls around me seemed to have transformed, seemed to comprise nothing but slithering, moving bodies, their sounds almost ubiquitous. I heard breathing and groaning, the digging and slithering that were now almost frantic. Under it all, however, I heard these things giggle in anticipation, saw hands scratch against it from inside, saw disgusting, inhuman faces press into it. In that moment, I tore up my radio, pressed send, and screamed into it that I was at the old boarding house and needed help. A voice answered, asking what was wrong, but I didn't get to say anything. With a loud slam, the door to the basement burst open. At first, I saw nothing but the impenetrable darkness of the hallway. But then, I could make out a giant head. A head much, much bigger than the one I'd seen before. I watched as giant jaws unhinged, and a thick, black tongue licked over non-existent lips. In stunned silence and half in a trance, I tried to take in the true horror of the creature. Its body was heavy, bloated, and worm-like. It dragged itself forward on a multitude of spidery arms, like some sort of abominable centipede. Yet its body didn't end, grew longer and longer, continued on, extending endlessly as the thing slithered ever closer. My gun, where the hell was my gun? I couldn't look away, couldn't tear myself from the ungodly sight in front of me. Instead, my hand scrambled over the lobby's floor, desperately trying to find it, to feel it. Then the creature reached me. I felt its hand close around my leg. First one, then two, then more. I heard it giggle and make sounds close to that of a human, but also entirely different. Words, I realized. Words in some sort of guttural language I couldn't understand. A second later, I was yanked toward it, yanked in the direction of its giant open mouth. Stephen. Oh God, that's what must have happened to Stephen. The deepest, darkest sense of despair overcame me. I felt just like he must have felt, like a small, tiny boy, prey in the grasp of an indomitable predator. Then my hand closed around the cold, hard metal of the gun, and in an instant I pointed at the creature. It screeched when the bullets hit its body, yet it didn't bleed, seemed barely hurt at all. But it was enough. The grip around my legs loosened, and kicking and screaming, I scrambled away. Yet the creature didn't retreat, seemed merely to gather itself. But I was unrelenting. I shot again and again and again, and finally the creature vanished in the hallway's darkness. Right away, angry screams resounded from all around me, from within the walls. There's so many more of them, I thought. So many more. It was an insane, mad cacophony, one that reverberated through the entire old boarding house. I fought myself to my feet, stumbled toward the entrance door, threw myself against it and clawed at its knob in a desperate attempt to get it open. Old Hubert's locks, I remembered, all those damn locks. I screamed for help, screamed for anyone. But of course, out here, no one would hear me. No one would come to help me. Then, not knowing what else to do, I pointed the gun at the door's hinges and fired. When I threw myself against it this time, the door gave way in its entirety and crashed open. Once more, pain shot through my entire body, but I didn't stop. I crawled away, scrambled on, desperately trying to get to my feet. I was halfway across the yard, my body a bloodied and battered mess, when a police car arrived at the edge of the yard. Jesus Christ, Rick, what the hell happened to you? It was Deputy Williams. I remember nothing I said. I must have screamed about the creatures, and about something coming for me. Yet when I turned around, there was nothing. The small lobby was empty, and the old boarding house itself was quiet. I laughed. They'd gone back. Back into hiding. Back into the walls, the basement, or wherever the hell they'd come from. They weren't willing to show their presence. Didn't want to make themselves known. And must have gone back into hiding the moment Williams arrived. By now, he had gotten a hold of me, was talking to me and trying to calm me down. That's when I saw him. Leaning over his fence and watching the entire spectacle with a cold, hard look on his face. Old Hubert. Then I passed out. When I awoke in our town's small hospital, my entire body was in pain, and I was utterly exhausted. I opened my mouth, but closed it again moments later, unable to even speak. After a few minutes, an attending nurse noticed I was awake. She told me I'd suffered from a major panic attack. I was almost delirious when I was brought in and rambled on incoherently. Not only this, my entire body was covered in a multitude of injuries. I'd received a variety of cuts when I'd fallen through the glass door. I had a deep gash in my right calf and a dislocated shoulder. Before I could make another attempt at speaking to her, the nurse told me what I needed the most right now was rest. I fell back on the bed and closed my eyes. Then the memory of what happened returned to me. Those creatures. The things in the walls. I saw their disfigured faces again. Their giant jaws, their misshapen teeth, their hands, their disgustingly bloated bodies. Panic washed over me once more. What the hell were those things? How could anything like that be fucking real? My hands clung to the sides of the hospital bed and I began hyperventilating. The nurse was with me in an instant, administering a sedative, and soon I drifted back off to sleep again. The next time I awoke, my hopes for having some rest were shattered instantly. Deputy Sheffield, or now Sheriff Sheffield, was sitting at the other end of the room, with Deputy Williams standing right next to him. Sheffield was still an asshole, and seemed to have become an even bigger one in his later years. He stared me down with an expression of barely restrained anger.
"What the fuck were you thinking, Reeds?"
I opened my mouth to say something, to tell him about the creatures, but realized how ridiculous I'd sound.
"Do you have any fucking idea what you did? What that little skid of yours caused? I knew you were a goddamn idiot. I always knew. That's why I didn't want you on the force, but this?"
"Boss," I started, but he cut me off right away.
"Oh, don't you dare make any excuses, you little shitface. You know damn well that place is off limits. And off limits for a good reason. We had enough trouble with that scum breaking in 2 months ago. And now I find out that one of my deputies did the exact same thing. Have you fucking lost it?"
At this point, I'd had it, and told him what was going on at the Jensen boarding house. But the moment the word creatures left my mouth, he burst out laughing, shaking his head. It was a cold, entirely humorless sound. Then his eyes focused on me again.
"The fuck's wrong with you, Reeds? Creatures in the fucking walls? How old are you to still believe in that goddamn bullshit? You hit your head or something?"
Then his eyes turned to slits, and a sly grin showed on his face.
"Maybe you've been hitting the bottle. Maybe something else? A little something to spur the imagination?"
Williams next to him sighed.
"Get your shit together, Reeds. What happened when you and your dumbass friends broke into the place was almost 2 decades ago. Get the hell over it. And once you're out of here, you get your ass right down to the station. Hand in that badge and..."
"What? You're kicking me out because..."
"Because the entire fucking town is in an uproar. Things have finally calmed down. And everyone thought of that place as just another goddamn building. But now everybody's talking about it again. Mr. Hubert was out of it, dragged himself all the way to the station, and held us this long lecture about God knows what."
When I heard this, I jerked up, but for an entirely different reason. Old Hubert. I remembered how he'd stood there, remembered his face as he watched me stumble from the building. While my boss continued to lay into me, slowly the memories of my many encounters with the old man returned to me. First, the way he'd acted when we were there 2 weeks ago. The way he wanted me out of that building as soon as possible. Then I thought back to my very first encounter with him in the forest, and I realized how much of it didn't add up. He told us it was him who chased us, and back then we'd believed him. Yet the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. How could he have overtaken us without us seeing him? Why did he know that this random hole in the forest was nothing but a foxhole? And why the hell had he even been out there if the forest was off limits? I thought about how he'd always been watching the place, and how he'd always chased us away the moment we got close to it. Most of all, I remembered the words he'd said, had screamed at the boarding house when he came back with Jerry in his arms. "Not for you." My God. For the first time, I realized something I'd never truly realized before. Something that had only been half guesses until now. The old man knew. He knew about those things. And he must have known about them for all those years. No, I thought. Not just known. Somehow he was involved with them. in league with whatever those things were. After ranting on for another 10 minutes, Sheriff Sheffield finally left, Deputy Williams trailing after him. Even then, I didn't get any rest. The realization about old Hubert, and the rage that came over me, drove me almost mad. I thought I'd be out of the hospital within a few days, and so did the staff. The worst of my injuries had been a dislocated shoulder, after all. It turned out, however, that the gash on my calf had gotten infected. The doctors didn't know what had caused it, but I knew what it was. Those fingers. Those disgusting fingers. And their claws that had dug deep into my flesh. It took almost 3 weeks before I could leave the hospital. For one of those, I was almost entirely delirious, pumped full of antibiotics, and whatever other drugs they'd used to fight the infection. I was told multiple times I was lucky to be alive, and things might very well have taken a turn for the worse. Once I was out, I felt like a shadow of the man I'd been before. I was weak, had lost weight, and was in an almost perpetual state of pain due to what the doctors referred to as infectious damage to my nervous system. Yet, despite all that pain, I was more driven, more determined than I'd ever been before. Even more so than when I'd set out to investigate the old boarding house on my own. Old Hubert. I had to talk to him. I had to confront him about the Jensen boarding house, and about the creatures that lurked in its depths. As I walked through town, I couldn't help but reminisce about the many encounters my friends and I had had with the old man. Now only I was left. All my friends were gone. Eric and his family had left the town behind. Jerry was dead. Stephen was too. Had been taken by those things inside the walls. All of them were gone because of that damn building. And because of old Hubert. Yet I'd make sure to get the answers I wanted. When old Hubert's farm came into view, I noticed for the first time how run down the place had become. The roof was covered in holes. The plaster on the walls had chipped away in many places, and the old shack next to it had all but collapsed in on itself. Even the sturdy fence surrounding his property was nothing but a half-rotten remnant of its past glory. No wonder. Old Hubert had to be close to 80 by now, much too old to take care of such a huge place all by himself. From afar, I could already see the old man. Just like when I was a child, he sat out there on his bench, keeping watch over the Jensen boarding house and what little remained of his once proud herd of cattle. I knew why he was out here again. It was because of the fresh surge of rumors, and the town's renewed interest in the place. It was daylight now, and for the first time I could see just how much he'd changed. Little remained of the giant figure he'd been during my youth. He looked terribly exhausted. Frail, even. At first, I thought he dozed off, because he paid my approach no heed. Then I saw that his tiny, glassy eyes were trained on the old boarding house. On that terrible, haunted place. "Mr. Hubert?" I greeted him. When his eyes found me, his expression darkened. Even though he was sitting and I was standing, I still found him staring me down. And for a moment, all the fearful respect I'd felt for him as a child returned.
"You. How dare you break into..."
I had my reasons.
"And what might those damned reasons be? Because 2 pieces of goddamn scum went missing? Because all those stupid stories that continue to be spread around town?"
I was quiet for a moment, surprised by the energy, by the sheer rage in which he threw those words at me. Then I shook my head and stepped in closer. "No. Because of my friends. Because of Jerry and Stephen." The old man just stared at me, not understanding what I was talking about. "Do you mind if I take a seat?" I finally asked, pointing at the bench.
"Do whatever you want. Not like I can stop you anyway."
I sat down and began to tell him. "Jerry and Stephen. They were with me when we broke into the place all those years ago. Do you remember? It was the middle of the night, and there was this teenager with us, Jerry's brother. You eventually came to the boarding house, and you got Jerry out after." For a few seconds, the old man seemed confused, but then recognition came over his face.
"You were one of them troublemakers. Lewis's grandson, right? The Reed's boy?
I nodded. Guess we gave you quite a hard time back then. When I said this, the old man gave a weak bout of laughter.
Oh, well, you're just boys. Can't blame you with all those dumb tales and rumors around. It was only a matter of time before some of you break in. It didn't matter how much I or anyone else tried to stop you. But this place, it's bad.
I nodded as he said this, and for a moment I couldn't help but shiver. The old man noticed.
When you broke in the other week, you saw them, didn't you? The way you acted.
I nodded once more. What are they? The old man was quiet for a moment, and I could see the fear on his face. When he spoke again, his voice was nothing but a whisper. His eyes trained on the old boarding house.
God, if I know. Slithering things. Monsters, creatures. Does it matter? They live in the walls, the basement, even under the town. Might have been here ever since the town was founded. Hell, maybe even longer. These things, they come from deep, deep down. From the guts of the earth.
Suddenly, he had to stop himself, and was riddled by a deep-set, hard cough before he spat a chunk of bloody mucus to the ground. Mr. Hubert, are you...
Don't need no pity from anyone,
he snapped at me. At first, his outburst took me aback. But then the one question I'd been burning to ask returned to my mind. How long have you known about these things?
I grew up next to the damn place. I'm living next door. You notice things. You hear them. You see people going in but never coming out again. You hear the noises, sounds. That damn family, they were taking care of those things. Providing for them. That damn boarding house. They ran it for one reason. For one reason alone. To feed them. To appease them.
But why would they...
Because they made a deal with them. All in exchange for power. For wealth.
Wait, so you're telling me those stories about the cult, about rituals and devil worshipping are actually true?
Some might be. Others might not. But it was no devil they worshipped. It's something different. And something all too real. One night, Jensen approached me. Talked about the bond families had shared and all that bullshit. Was stark raving mad, drunk out of his mind. He told me about those things in the walls. What they were. Why they were here. Told me of old notes, of diaries, what his ancestors did. He said that these damn things always come back. And what would happen if they wouldn't be appeased. He begged and cried and told me to help him. Didn't believe a word he said, of course. Told him he was mad. Shouldn't be the last time he talked about it, though. I never believed him. Hell, I humored him. Every couple of months he bought one of my animals. Provisions, he always said, wearing this ghastly grin on his face. Oh, but he paid me well. And back then I was a young man, freshly married, just taking over the family farm, so who was I to care? And eventually the place hit a sour streak. All those new buildings, no one came anymore. Not enough people showed up, and then Jensen ran away with his family, or rather, what was left of it.
What was left of it?
Those things. And they're hungry. Always hungry. It was only a matter of time before they'd take what was promised.
So that's why the place was abandoned, I mumbled to myself. Finally, I knew the reason. The thing that had puzzled everyone in town for decades. The old man, however, merely gave me a nod.
Once he'd left, those things were still there. They were still active. They're growing restless. I heard them digging. I heard it every night. They were tunneling toward the town, the forest, all to find people, to take them away.
That hole in the forest, I said, grimacing.
Yeah, even out there. That's how far they'd spread.
That means that hiker really was taken by something out in the forest. This time the old man said nothing, and instead the tears began streaming from his eyes, and he sobbed in abject misery. Mr. Hubert, what's...
I didn't want to, of course I didn't. I never meant to do any of this, but those things, they took Mariana. They took little Becky, and dug their way into our home, and dragged them away. I knew they'd only be the first. I knew they'd come for the rest of the town. So eventually I was forced to take over, to keep doing the same thing Jensen had done before me.
The same thing Jensen had done?
He left me with instructions, with notes. That's when I learned about the deal his ancestors had made. Every season they provided a sacrifice. In exchange, they'd gotten wealth and power. As long as they kept their part of the bargain, there was nothing those things could do. Unless you entered their territory. Words of power or some humbug like that. Jensen even provided me with a lavish sum. All to do what was necessary. To give those things what was promised.
Sacrifice? Wait, you don't mean you...
Someone had to do it.
He cut me off.
As I said, the animals were never enough. They were not what was really promised to them. You know how many people find their way here? To this town? Drifters, squatters, hitchhikers, lonely wanderers. Even people like that scum who came here 2 months ago. Sometimes I'd lure them to the place myself. Others I invited them into my home, and occasionally I'd follow them out into the woods with my hunting rifle.
I just sat there, staring at the ghastly, broken old man next to me. I thought he was related to the events at the boarding house. But this? Dear God. How many? I finally asked in a shaken voice. The old man could only shake his head.
Too many. Way too many,
he said in a voice full of misery. How could you just...
If I wouldn't have, those things would have come for all of us. For this entire town. For everyone in it. Everyone would have suffered just like I did. No child deserves that fate. To be taken away and... Damn that Jensen. Damn him and his entire family. Damn them all to hell.
I opened my mouth, but closed it again. Not sure what to say. Right here, next to me, sat a man who'd killed countless people. Murdered them in cold blood. Shot them in the woods. All to... And yet, what could I say? I'd seen those things. I knew what Jerry must have seen, what had happened to Stephen. I could only imagine what would have happened if the old man hadn't done what he did. Dear God, was all I could say.
There was no other way. No other way,
the old man mumbled to himself. His body was shaking. The tears kept streaming from his eyes, and his lips were quivering as he was haunted by his very own demons, by the ghastly things he'd done. So, what can we do? I mean, can't we do anything against those things? What if we burnt the building down? Wouldn't it kill them? They're in the walls, aren't they? When I said this, the old man gave a cold, hard laugh before his head jerked in my direction.
Don't you think people tried? Before Jensen fled, when they came for his family, he tried. I did the same. Didn't know what those things were for the longest time. Didn't believe in Jensen's nonsense, his notes. I grew curious. All those sounds, the digging, the shadows. When I saw what they really were, I attacked one of them. That's why they came for my family. Those damn things, they were teaching me a lesson. Showing me what would happen if I dared to go against them.
What about the police? Why didn't you ever try talking to them? If you told them everything, then...
And who'd believe me? Even if. There's too many of them. They come from too far down. Their tunnels reach out deep into the woods, God knows where else. If the police stormed the place, hell, if we burned it to the ground, they'd just hide. And come back stronger. In bigger numbers. And Jensen, in his ramblings, he told me about what he read in those old diaries. He even showed them to me one night. Stories about caverns deep below the town. Something resting down there. Something abominable. Something much bigger. And much, much older. The ones we see up here are just the smallest part of what truly nests beneath the town. Don't know if any of that is true, but if it is, there's nothing the police or anyone else can do. Not out here. Not in the middle of nowhere.
But someone has to...
Don't waste your time, boy. Best you can do is let it go. Just get out of this town, move away like so many others did. This town's dying. It's a damn good thing it is.
I didn't know what to say anymore. Eventually, I just sighed and got up. You know, Mr. Hubert, given all you just told me and what you've done, I should take you in. At least if I was still part of the force. But honestly, you deserve much more than that. I always knew there was something wrong with you. You're a wicked, disgusting creature. But even if I don't want to, I understand why you did it. When those words left my mouth, when I spat them at him, the old man slumped down, an expression of purest misery on his face. When I turned to leave, I could hear him sob quietly behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't go back. No, I had no uplifting words for him. Deep down, I hoped the old bastard would suffer for all those he must have sacrificed over the years. Yet my words must have struck a chord with him. That same night, a fire rose high into the air. A fire from the direction of the Jensen boarding house. The moment I saw the flickering flames, saw a sky alight with fire, I set out to see what was going on. The old fool had said it was useless, that it wouldn't do a damn thing. Hell, he'd said it would doom us all, and yet... When I arrived, however, I saw it wasn't the old boarding house that was burning, but old Hubert's farm. People had gathered in the street, watching the flames in our town's small fire department desperately trying to put them out. I heard from afar that people had seen a figure in the flames. A figure who'd not bothered to get away. Eventually, all that was left of old Hubert and his home, nothing but rubble and smoldering cinders. I never learned what truly happened that night, or why the old man had done what he'd done. I can only guess he'd had enough, broke down, and decided to end it all. One thing he said, however, is true. There are more of those things out there. Sometimes, when I'm down in my basement, when I listen, When I truly listen, I can almost hear them as they continue to tunnel beneath the town. Eventually, I went back to the old boarding house during the early hours of the night, and I listened to those ghastly old walls. I heard it. The grinding between mortar and brick. The slithering inside. The sounds everyone else thinks are caused by rats. I know those things are growing restless. Angry. Yet what can I do? The old man was right about one thing. Who's going to believe a story about slithering monstrosities and some sort of ancient evil below the town? Even if they believe me, what could be done anyway? What could stop them? No, there's nothing anyone can do against those things. I told myself nothing would happen. Prayed that old Hubert was wrong and that, even after all I'd seen, his words were nothing but humbug. I was wrong. These past weeks, they began moving. First, a man living alone at the other end of town vanished without a trace. Then, a week ago, 2 girls who went out to play in the woods similarly vanished, never to be seen again. The police are investigating. Sheriff Sheffield calls it a kidnapping, or the work of a deranged serial killer. But I know what's truly going on. As I sit here, I curse the Jensen family, the old boarding house, and especially old Hubert, for leaving me with this, for making me the only one who knows what's at stake. Yet I know there's only one thing I can do. The only thing I can do to keep not only this town, but also boys like Jerry and Steven safe. Someone's got to take up the mantle and become the next caretaker of the Jensen boarding house and the horrors that lurk within it. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/JordanGroupeHorror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.